Hello, everyone. A very good evening and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep. Welcome back to our discussion on international relations. Before we begin, please let me know if I'm audible and if the video is clearly visible. Let me know in the comments. Great. Everything looks good. So before we start, couple of announcements. One, the recordings of these classes shall be available indefinitely. Many of you had a concern regarding the cap on the number of days that we were planning to place. But based on popular demand, we've ensured that the recordings will be available indefinitely, that is, throughout the term of your course. Second, if any of you have difficulty in reaching the mentorship number, usually it's because you're not calling from the registered mobile number. Please ensure that you call from the registered phone number for the mentorship. Is that clear? So these are two things you have to remember. With this, let's get started with module 4 under international relations. Yesterday, I had given a small exercise to you guys, a small assignment. Let's see how many of you have done it. Did you guys read about the pipeline project that I was discussing? I mentioned a pipeline project between India and Bangladesh that was recently inaugurated. I had asked you guys to read about it. So can you let me know the 3 points about this project? What's the name of this pipeline? Where does it connect? What does it transport? These are the 3 things you have to note down. Okay, very good. Some of you are getting the name right. It is called the India-Bangladesh Friendship Pipeline. That is the name of this pipeline project. The India-Bangladesh Friendship Pipeline, IBFP. What does it transport? What is this pipeline project meant to transport from India to Bangladesh? Pratyaksh has given the right answer. Very good. It will transport high-speed diesel. Essentially, diesel will be transported from India to Bangladesh. Any idea from which place, from which refinery in India will we supply this diesel to Bangladesh? It connects from Siliguri to Parbatipur. Very good. It transports the diesel from Numaligarh refinery. Very good. In Assam, India has an oil refinery at Numaligarh. From the Numaligarh oil refinery in Assam, diesel will be transported through this pipeline via Siliguri in India to Parbatipur in Bangladesh. Is that clear? I feel this topic will be very, very important for your prelims, for next year's prelims. So please note down these 3 key points. This will also help Bangladesh in reducing the import cost. Because earlier, Bangladesh was dependent on diesel procured through Mongla port and the Chattogram port. Remember, we saw the Mongla port and Chittagong port yesterday in a map. So Bangladesh was procuring high-speed diesel from other countries, which was being supplied through Mongla port and Chittagong port. This route was increasing the transportation cost. So because of this friendship pipeline project, the transportation cost for Bangladesh will reduce. Is that clear? It will benefit the agriculture sector and the transport sector in Bangladesh. Because agriculture sector depends a lot on diesel, right? Along with transportation sector. These sectors in Bangladesh will benefit. It will reduce the transportation cost for the country. So please note down these key points as UPSC might ask a factual question in your prelims. Very good. I'm really happy that many of you have read about this. So now let's start with the next chapter. Let's take a look at India's relations with Myanmar. Since we are covering the eastern neighbors of India, we've already completed Bangladesh. Now let's finish the other eastern neighbor, which is Myanmar. This is another important chapter, both for your prelims and mains. Given the current situation in Myanmar and how it affects India, the topic becomes extremely important for your mains and also for your prelims. So we have to cover this country in complete detail. There are many key issues to discuss and analyze, and I promise that I will cover every single topic that is needed under India-Myanmar relations. Let's begin by looking at the location of Myanmar. Myanmar occupies a strategic location as far as India is concerned. From India's perspective, Myanmar has a strategic location in the region. There are many benefits that arise from Myanmar. There are many concerns and issues and threats that emanate from Myanmar. It is because of this reason Myanmar becomes a crucial neighbor for India. So by using these maps, I will be highlighting some important points, and I expect all of you to write down these key points. We will talk about the significance of Myanmar for India. We shall understand the role of Myanmar in India's foreign policy. What interests of India, what national interests of India are at stake in Myanmar. That is something we should understand. So if you look at the map, the first thing that comes to mind is that Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country. Please write down these points along with me. I'll be pointing out around 5 or 6 important points. I expect a mains question to be asked on these lines. So please pay attention. Remember that Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country. It's not a South Asian country. So essentially, Myanmar is like a bridge. It's like a land bridge that is connecting India with the Southeast Asia region. Is that clear? If you look at the map here, you will notice the northeastern states that share boundaries with Myanmar. So states such as Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, and Mizoram. These are the 4 northeastern states that share a boundary with Myanmar. So essentially, the northeast region of India, India's northeast, is directly connected to Southeast Asia via this land border. That's why I told you Myanmar is like a bridge, a land bridge connecting Northeast India with Southeast Asia. Is that clear? So this fulfills our objectives of Look East, Act East policy. For the success of our Look East, Act East policy, our relations with Myanmar is extremely crucial because Myanmar is like a gateway. Myanmar is a gateway or a land bridge that is connecting us with Southeast Asia. Is that clear? So this border that we share, this land border, it's around 1,600 kilometers approximately. It's a little more than 1,600 kilometers in length. And it's a critical border for India, both for economic reasons and also for strategic reasons. For economic reasons and as well as strategic reasons, this border is crucial for India. Is that clear? So I'll explain what benefits arise from Myanmar, what are the security issues and challenges that we face from Myanmar. That is something you should understand in detail. Now also notice in this map, if you observe, there are 2 tri-junction points. You have a tri-junction point over here where India meets with China and Myanmar. So this becomes a tri-junction point where 3 countries are meeting. In the south, over here, we have another tri-junction point where India is meeting with Bangladesh and Myanmar. So when such trijunction points are present, they become strategically important because there are three countries which are meeting at one single location. So when it comes to Myanmar and India, there are two trijunction points, one to the north with China, one to the south with Bangladesh. Now, all across this border, along this India-Myanmar border, the terrain is very complex. It's a very complex terrain that you find. You have mountainous regions, dense forests, and these areas are very remote in their location. They don't have adequate connectivity infrastructure. These are very remote areas, mountainous forested areas. So as a result, the border is highly porous. It's a highly porous border with several natural gaps. And by now, you already know what happens when such porous borders exist. We had a similar porous border with Bangladesh. We have a similar porous border with Nepal. So we studied the border challenges that we face with Nepal and Bangladesh. The same concerns and threats exist over here as well. It's a naturally porous border because of the complex geography of the region. And as a result, there are many security threats that emerge from across the border. Let's understand what kind of threats do we face here. See, just like Northeast India, even Myanmar is a multi-ethnic society. It's a multi-ethnic society which is home to several indigenous tribes. In the Northeast region, if you look at Nagaland, Mizoram, Assam, right, Manipur, in all the northeastern states, right, if you look at the composition of the society, they're all multi-ethnic societies where you have multiple indigenous communities or indigenous tribes that call the region their home. Similarly, on the other side of the border, in Myanmar as well, you find a similar demography. You find a similar human geography in Myanmar as well. You find multiple ethnic groups, indigenous tribes to be present here. Many of these tribes are connected with the tribes in India. There are several tribal groups, ethnic groups in Myanmar that share connections with the ethnic tribal groups of Northeast India. For example, you have the Nagas. Nagas are found not just in India. Subgroups of Nagas are found in Myanmar as well. Is that clear? Naga ethnic group is a very large, diverse ethnic group. Within the Nagas, you have many subgroups. So in India, Nagas are distributed across Nagaland, Manipur, even Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, even in parts of Mizoram. Even across the border in Myanmar, you find subgroups of Nagas who are connected with the Nagas of India. So they share familial links. They share very close cultural links since many centuries. Then the Kukis in Manipur, the Mizos of Mizoram, even they are connected with the Chin Zo community. This is a topic which is currently in news as well because of what's happening in Manipur. The Kukis of Manipur are connected to the Chin Zo community in Myanmar. Even Mizos have connection with the Chins and the Zo community. So they share ethnic links, familial, cultural links with each other. And as a result, the insurgency and tensions present in the region acquires a cross-border nature. Apart from the cultural links, apart from the economic links between these tribes and ethnic communities, the insurgency present here spills over on both sides of the border. Is that clear? For example, Naga insurgents like NSCN, they often found easy support in Myanmar from the Nagas on the other side of the border. So they have found a safe haven, a safe sanctuary some of the insurgent groups operating in India, they easily find a safe sanctuary on the other side in Myanmar because there is local support for them. Even Mizos, Kukis, and few other ethnic communities in India which have taken up armed insurgency, they find a safe sanctuary on the other side because they have related tribes who support them and shelter them. Sometimes from Myanmar as well, these ethnic tribes, they spill over to India, and this creates a security challenge for both the countries. It's a very complex equation. Of course, the tribes themselves are not to be blamed entirely, right? The region has a very complex social and economic and historical background, right? There are different reasons why these insurgent movements have started. But nevertheless, the insurgency here, it thrives and sustains because of the easy cross-border support that is available. So Northeast insurgents, they can easily cross over, they can easily infiltrate into Myanmar and find a safe haven where they can secure themselves from being targeted from India. They also find an easy supply of weapons, funds, and they can easily set up their training bases or camps away from the reach of Indian security forces. Because Myanmar is part of a region known as the Golden Triangle. Some of you might have heard about it. The Golden Triangle is roughly this region. This region covering Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. This region covering these three countries is referred to as the Golden Triangle region. It's one of the global hubs for drug production and drug trafficking. Essentially, organized crime is extremely prevalent in the Golden Triangle. Is that clear? Organized crime thrives in the Golden Triangle. So drug production, drug trafficking is very rampant. And as I told you in previous classes, wherever organized crime prevails, in that region, you will find terrorism and insurgency to be also present. Right? Along with drug trafficking, other criminal activities will also be present, like arms trafficking, for example. It's very easy to procure arms and weapons in this region. This region is also affected by wildlife trafficking, human trafficking. There are few cyber criminal gangs as well that operate in the Myanmar region, in the Golden Triangle region. So as organized crime thrives in this region, it creates a ready base for terror financing. It's easy to raise funds for terrorism and insurgent activities because money laundering is also widely rampant in the region. These criminal organizations that are involved in drug smuggling, arms smuggling, right? They keep converting the illegal wealth into legal wealth through money laundering. And part of the proceeds of money laundering reaches the hands of terror groups and insurgent groups, and it becomes an easy route for terror financing. Is that clear? So the presence of the Golden Triangle right next to India's eastern border is a major threat for India. Northeast insurgents in particular, they easily cross over, they find a safe sanctuary to hide, they get local support as well from the local tribes, and they can easily procure drugs, weapons, and all the funds they require. So this becomes a security challenge for India, a security nightmare for India. Along with this, the region also suffers from a refugee crisis. This is because of what Myanmar has done to its own people. Myanmar has been ruled by a military dictatorship for many decades. The military rule is very oppressive. It's known to violate human rights. And Myanmar's military junta, they have targeted several tribal groups and ethnic groups, including the Rohingya Muslim community. The Rohingyas of Myanmar are one of the most persecuted communities in the world, as they have been targeted by Myanmar's military junta and also by radical Buddhist groups in the country. Please remember that Myanmar is a Buddhist majority nation. It's a Buddhist country. And unfortunately, even in this religion of peace, which is rooted in the principle of ahimsa, you find a strand of radicalism and extremism. It's quite similar to Sri Lanka. Even in Sri Lanka, you have a strand of radical Buddhists who are Sinhalas who target the Tamil minorities. Similarly, in Myanmar as well, radical Buddhists have repeatedly targeted the Rohingya Muslims and many other minorities with the support of Myanmar's military. The military junta, the junta rule, is aligned with the radical Buddhist elements. So Rohingyas and as well as the Chins and several other ethnic tribal groups are repeatedly targeted, and as a result, they flee into India as refugees. They cross over the border into India in order to save their lives. So this puts the burden on India. It creates many challenges for India because of the refugee problems that are present along the India-Myanmar border. Is that clear? So these are some basic points that you should be familiar with regarding the geography and the location of Myanmar. And also don't forget, China is a major player in Myanmar. China exerts major influence in the country. The China factor is also crucial for Indian interests. China is very, very influential in Myanmar. China is very close to the military junta. China shares very good relations with the military dictatorship. And this has a direct role to play in compromising Indian interests. Because China has extended covert support to Northeast insurgent groups via Myanmar's territory. Please note down this point. Because of the influence it exercises, it has been waging a covert proxy war against India by using Myanmar as a base. Chinese intelligence and security agencies, they are known to provide support. They are known to provide funds and weapons to Northeast insurgent groups. Is that clear? Several Northeast insurgent outfits like ULFA, NSCN, and others, they have found ready support in Myanmar where Chinese intelligence and security agencies are involved. They have channeled funds and weapons to India's Northeast insurgent outfits, right? They have set up bases along the border here in Myanmar, and they repeatedly target India. This has been going on from 1960s. So there are multiple security threats for India, but at the same time, there are many opportunities as well, right? By using Myanmar, we can connect with Southeast Asian countries. We can link the Northeast region closely with Southeast Asian markets. India has some ambitious projects which are underway under the Look East Act East policy. We are focused mainly on connectivity. For connectivity with Southeast Asia, Myanmar is crucial. So this is an integral part of our Look East Act East policy. Is that clear? So please make a note of all these key points I've written here and ensure that you revise this again. This is a brief summary of the importance of Myanmar to India. It covers more or less all the key points I want to discuss in this chapter. The role of China, the presence of so many insurgent groups and criminal organizations, the border security challenges, and how all of this affects stability in Northeast India. Is that clear? So if you have any questions related to this, please let me know. If you have any specific questions, please bring it up. And after that, we'll proceed with the discussion and we'll look at the other aspects of India-Myanmar relations. Amit is asking, sir, what is Look East policy? Look East policy is a foreign policy doctrine of India launched in 1991 by the Narasimha Rao government to prioritize India's relations with Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. Now, this policy has been upgraded by Prime Minister Modi to the Act East policy. All right. So, under the Look East Act East policy, we are giving more focus on Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. So, for now, that is enough. Don't worry. We'll study that in detail in a separate class. We have a separate class for Look East Act East policy. Sridevi is asking on these points, what type of questions can be framed? See, UPSC can ask a straightforward question. It can ask you, why is Myanmar significant for Indian interests in the Southeast Asia region? Or what threats do we face from Myanmar? Or what are the border security challenges we face along India-Myanmar border? So such questions can appear in your mains exam. Harsh is asking why Indian government has not raised its voice against the military junta despite its human rights violations. I'll answer that question. Don't worry. That's part of my discussion. We will discuss the background of India-Myanmar relations. We'll study the political situation in Myanmar. So there I'll explain why India has not criticized Myanmar's military junta. Lyrin Lakpam is asking, does illegal migrant influx from Myanmar threaten indigenous people of Northeast India? Not really. Because as I told you, some of the illegal migrants who come in, right, or refugees who come in, they are connected to the tribes in Northeast India. So they actually shelter them and support them. Like Kukis, for example. Kukis have sheltered the Chins and the Zo community after the crisis broke out last 2 years ago. Right? In the last 2 years, Myanmar is going through a deep political crisis. And Myanmar's military has been targeting the Chin community in particular. So Chins have fled to India in large numbers. They have entered Manipur and Mizoram. So in both the states, the Mizos and Kukis have sheltered and protected the Chins because they are connected to the tribes. They have familial relations with these tribes. On humanitarian grounds, they have sheltered them. So locally in Northeast India, refugees from Myanmar, they're not seen as threats. What is the form of government in Myanmar? As I told you, Myanmar is under a military rule. It's under a military dictatorship. Do we share open or partially open border? Rashmi is asking. We don't share an open border with Myanmar, not even a partially open border. It's a closed border. There are hard border controls in place, right? We have very strict visa immigration policies in place as well. So we don't have any open border system or partially open border with Myanmar. The open border system is only with Nepal. And with Bhutan, we have a partially open border. With all the other countries, our borders are closed. We have a strict visa immigration policy, and only those who meet the criteria are allowed entry into the country. So those who come in other routes, they become illegal migrants to India. Why China is influential in Myanmar? Why not India? See, I told you China is very influential, but I didn't tell you India is not influential, right? So don't assume that. India is also very influential in Myanmar. We'll study that under this chapter. What is the competition between India and China in Myanmar? I'll address that point. Please elaborate on China's covert proxy war. We will do that. We'll come to that. Don't worry. We'll discuss those details. All right. So guys, these were some basic points I wanted to raise at the very beginning of this chapter. Now let's have a detailed discussion on India-Myanmar relations. Whatever points I discussed, I've added them in the slides as well. In the next few slides, you find all these points in detail. All right, so please go through them. I'll take you through those points as well. India-Myanmar have a deep-rooted historical, cultural relationship, right? Since ancient medieval times, we share a very close link with Myanmar. In fact, several kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent had a lot of influence in Myanmar. In Myanmar, you also find a very strong Tamil community present since centuries. right? That shows the close cultural links, the deep-rooted economic, historical links we have with the country. So Myanmar was earlier known as Burma under colonial rule. And this is something we share as a part of our history. Both India and Myanmar have experienced colonial rule. So Burma was a British colony. It was a British colony and it was kept separate from British India. So Burma was a separate British colony of its own, but there have been very close historical, cultural, and economic relations between today's India and today's Myanmar. Right? Historically, there have been very close links. So today we share a long land boundary with this country, along with a maritime boundary in the Bay of Bengal. This is another important point. Myanmar is just not a land neighbor of India, it's a maritime neighbor of India. We share a maritime boundary in the Bay of Bengal, and Myanmar is very close to our Andaman Nicobar Islands, which are strategically located in the Bay of Bengal. We have very close strategic relations with this country, especially in the field of defense and security. India and Myanmar share very close defense and security relations. All right, we will discuss that in detail. India has a lot of investments in Myanmar, and we are involved in several important projects in the country. So we shall examine all these points going forward. But the topmost priority for India in Myanmar is to ensure that there is political stability in the country. Because when a country doesn't have political stability, that is when the security problems increase. In fact, one reason why so many criminal groups, insurgent terrorist groups have flourished in Myanmar is because the country hasn't seen political stability in the last 60 to 70 years. It has gone through a lot of political turmoil. The people of Myanmar have suffered extensively. The country has seen a lot of unrest. And this lack of political stability is what makes Myanmar vulnerable to the threats of criminal organizations and terrorist and insurgent groups. Is that clear? So India's top priority here is to ensure political stability and maintain good relations. Maintain good relations with whoever is in power. That is, whoever forms the government in the country, right? India seeks good relations with them. We don't see whether it's a democratically elected government or whether it's a military dictatorship. Irrespective of who comes to power, who runs the government in the country, India seeks and maintains cordial relations with them because from a security point of view, Myanmar is critical. To secure this border, to stabilize the Northeast region and protect India's sovereignty, our relations with Myanmar is critical. Is that clear? So this is a prime reason why we don't criticize the acts of the military junta. This has been a well-established policy of India since the 1960s. So to understand more about this, I have to take you through the political history of Myanmar. So let's discuss the background in detail and understand the present situation and what has been India's policy towards Myanmar. So let's study this in detail. I'll open a couple of new slides and I'll help you understand the deep-rooted political ties between the two countries. So Myanmar became independent from British rule in 1948, immediately after India's independence. So prior to this, during the Second World War, Indian soldiers, they had fought on behalf of the British and the Allied powers against the invading Japanese forces in today's Nagaland, Myanmar region. During the World War, right, Indian troops made a very big contribution to the Allied efforts by fighting on behalf of the British and the allied countries. So Indian soldiers have seen action around the world, from Europe to Africa to West Asia. But here in the east, right, that's near Nagaland and Myanmar of today, in this region, the Indian soldiers fought a major battle with the invading Japanese forces. Back then, Japan was a notorious country. It was an imperial fascist country like Nazi Germany. It had aligned with Hitler's Germany and Italy's Mussolini. So Japan had committed brutal atrocities across Asia, in China, in Vietnam, in today's Indonesia and Singapore, right? Across Southeast Asia, even in the Korean region, the Japanese imperial fascist forces had committed a lot of atrocities and captured territories. Their final objective was to reach India, right? To defeat Britain in India. But what held back the Japanese forces was the Indian resistance that was offered. So we have a history that goes back to the World War times as well. We have a much deep-rooted cultural, economic relationship, right? You find traces of Hinduism. There is a strong Buddhist connect. As I told you, there is a Tamil community that is present even today in Myanmar. So these are the historical, cultural links that we share with the country, right? So after becoming independent, after it freed itself from British rule, the country had transitioned into a democracy. It had a new government in place which was bringing civilian rule back, and democracy was being installed in the country. But very soon, Myanmar faced a lot of problems. It faced massive economic challenges. It faced internal rebellions. There were many internal rebellions. It continues even today. And multiple insurgencies broke out in Myanmar as well, led by the native tribes. Some of the native indigenous communities, they rebelled against Myanmar's government, right? The economic and social problems created divisions within the country and triggered unrest, and it led to insurgencies which destabilized the country. So following this, Myanmar's military blamed the civilian government for all the problems. Myanmar's military, the army generals, they blamed the government, they blamed democracy for all these problems. And in the 1960s, that is in 1962, the military captured power and turned the country into a dictatorship. Is that clear? So Myanmar enjoyed independence and democracy for hardly 14 years. By 1962, it had fallen under military dictatorship, and we refer to such military rule as the rule of the junta or the junta rule. In geopolitics, it's a very common term. We say that the country is ruled by the military junta. So if you read in newspapers that if a country has junta rule, right, it means the country has been taken over by the military. The government has been thrown out. So elections, democracy has been suspended, and the military has captured the power and it has established a dictatorship. Recently, for example, right, in Niger, in many other African countries, there has been a military takeover. So we call all these military dictatorships as the military junta. All right, it's a very common term used in geopolitics, in international relations. So in 1962, Myanmar came under the rule of the junta, and since then, the military has dominated the politics of the country. It has seen democracy for a very brief period of time. Other than that, the country has been ruled and dominated by the military. The military junta has been very close to radical Buddhists. As it's a Buddhist majority nation, the military depends on support from the Buddhist factions. And there are few radical Buddhist elements who have very close relations with the military, and they often work together. They have the same interests. The military has retained control for such a long time by serving the interests of the radical Buddhists and the majoritarian community. That is the reason why minorities are targeted. And in any dictatorship, as you know, human rights are always violated. There has been large-scale violation of human rights in the country over the last 60 years. Multiple uprisings have been crushed with brutal force, and civilians do not enjoy fundamental rights in the country. Is that clear? So the military is supreme. It has had complete control over the politics and the economy of the country, thus making the military junta the formidable authority, the most formidable authority in the country. So from 1962 till 2010, Myanmar was under junta rule. Is that clear? Let me just open a new slide here. From 1962 till 2010, Myanmar suffered extensively because of the military rule in the country. During this period, one attempt was made to fight for democracy. This was in the 1980s, between 1986 to 1988. There was a pro-democracy movement that we witnessed in Myanmar. Is that clear? We witnessed a massive pro-democracy movement in the 1980s. It was led by a very popular leader. You would have heard about her as well, known as Aung San Suu Kyi. Under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi, her political party, the NLD, the National League for Democracy, this party, under her leadership, fought for democracy in the country. This was the party set up by her father, the first leader of Myanmar, who had introduced democracy back in 1950s. Is that clear? So her father was the first democratic leader in Myanmar after independence. So democracy had been crushed since then by the military. So in 1980s, the daughter, Aung San Suu Kyi, she tried reviving the party and she fought for democracy with popular support from the people. This movement had popular civilian support because the people were frustrated with decades of military rule and dictatorship. They enjoyed no basic rights, no fundamental rights. Right? All their aspects of life was dominated by the military. So under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, there was a mass uprising that we saw in 1980s. But as you can expect, the military junta crushed the pro-democracy movement. The pro-democracy movement was crushed with brutal force. Hundreds of innocent civilians were killed and slaughtered. Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest. What we saw was a complete destruction of democracy and basic rights, fundamental rights in the country. So following this crisis in 1980s, the Western countries led by US, the European countries, and other powers like Japan, Australia, and the others, they all imposed economic sanctions on Myanmar to punish the military junta and to favor the pro-democracy movement. These Western democracies, they collectively targeted the country and they imposed crippling economic sanctions, targeting the military leaders and the resources of Myanmar's army. Is that clear? So Western countries cut off their ties with Myanmar. Following this human rights crisis, all the Western countries, they suspended ties with the country and they imposed economic sanctions targeting the military junta. Is that clear? But however, interestingly, India did not criticize. We did not break our relations with Myanmar, and we did not follow the Western sanctions. Is that clear? India took a very different path. Even though India is a neighbor of Myanmar and the world's largest democracy, right? We constantly uphold democratic rights and basic fundamental rights, right? India is seen as a champion of democratic fundamental rights. But despite large scale violations happening in our neighboring country, we didn't utter a word. It was the same in 1962 as well. Even in 1962, when the military captured power for the first time, India did not criticize the military. We did not condemn the military takeover. We continued the same approach in 1980s as well, when Aung San Suu Kyi's pro-democracy movement was crushed. Even when Western countries targeted Myanmar's military junta, India didn't utter a word. We didn't criticize them. We didn't cut off our ties. And we even bypassed the Western sanctions. So the question is, what explains this policy of India? What was India's motivation to tolerate the large-scale abuses and violations that were being committed? Right? What pushed India to go even against Western countries and take this stand as far as Myanmar was concerned? So let me explain this. Remember, in the first class, I told you that India's foreign policy is rooted in the principle of strategic autonomy, which means we follow an independent foreign policy. We are not guided by other countries. We don't blindly follow what other countries are doing or what other countries are trying to dictate. Now, just because Western countries are targeting Myanmar and imposing sanctions doesn't mean India should join them. Yes, what happened in Myanmar, what is still happening in Myanmar is highly unfortunate. Right? So if you look at it morally, ethically, it is wrong. But you cannot be idealistic all the time in your foreign policy. There comes a time when you have to adopt a realistic policy. It's often known as realpolitik. Realpolitik is a term in geopolitics that refers to a realistic foreign policy where you are pursuing your national interests at any cost. It is a cold-hearted pursuit of your national interests. Sometimes there's no other option. Right? Given the importance of Myanmar to India, India realized very early that we cannot antagonize the Myanmar government. Right? We can't afford to have problematic relations with this neighboring country at any cost because of all the concerns that we just discussed. Given the role of China, given the Chinese influence in the country, given the security threats, there was no way India could ignore these challenges. By 1960s, China and Myanmar had already aligned very closely with each other, especially after the 1962 war with India. China got even more aggressive against India and it started supporting Northeast insurgent groups. Chinese intelligence and security agencies, they started using Myanmar as a base to support various insurgent outfits like ULFA, NSCN, and the others throughout 60s, 70s, and 80s. So this was a credible threat for India's sovereignty. Is that clear? So Naga insurgents, and later when insurgencies broke out in other states of Northeast India, many insurgent groups, they found shelter in Myanmar because China was ready to help them out. China already had good relations with the military junta. So by using its influence, China was already sponsoring these insurgent organizations, which was a major security threat for India. So India had to counterbalance the Chinese influence and we had to counter China's covert war. China was fighting a secret proxy war against us. It was crucial for us to counter this at any cost, even at the cost of ignoring the violations that were happening in the country. And also, Myanmar has always been critical for connecting with Southeast Asia and for improving our ties with Southeast Asian countries. So, given these interests of India, India decided to follow an independent foreign policy, right? So, from the days of Prime Minister Nehru, subsequent governments have followed the same approach towards Myanmar. From 60s till now, India's policy towards Myanmar is a policy of realpolitik. We haven't been idealistic here. We haven't stood by the ideals of democracy, human rights, and fundamental rights. Right? We had to ignore these concerns, keep them aside, and maintain good relations with whoever is in power, be it a military dictatorship or an elected civilian government. So that is the realistic approach India has followed in order to safeguard and protect its national interests. Our national interest lies in protecting the border, in dealing with the security threats, and in countering Chinese influence. Is that clear? If India hadn't done this, India's sovereignty in the Northeast would have been threatened. Our stability in the Northeast would have been threatened by these insurgent groups, which had a lot of support in Myanmar, and China was involved in backing them and in arming and funding them. So countering this influence was crucial for India, and that explains our realistic policy towards Myanmar. So even when Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested and the democracy movement was crushed, India did not criticize the military rule. Aung San Suu Kyi actually has very close links with India. She has spent a large part of her life in India. All right, she's inspired by Gandhian ideals and principles. But despite all these connections, we had to sideline Aung San Suu Kyi. We had to sideline the NLD, and we gave support to the military junta. And believe it or not, despite all these developments, India maintained very close defense relations with the military junta. We have supplied arms and weapons to this regime which has violated human rights. Now, this is how geopolitics can be. Again, please don't judge. All right? See, it's very easy to sit in a classroom and judge what is right, what is wrong. That's why I told you in the first class itself. In international relations, there is no right or wrong. It's all about your perspective. It's all about your interests. Sometimes there's nothing you may be able to do. If India were to interfere in Myanmar, we would worsen the situation and harm our interests as well. So sometimes it's better to follow a realistic policy to at least protect your interests. Sometimes governments, countries are selfish in international relations. That is how it works. Right? Yes, it is a cold-hearted world. Right? It's not just India. Every power does the same. Look at United States. US has blindly pursued its own national interests all the time without following any idealistic principles. Look at China, look at Russia, European countries. They've all done the same. So sometimes we are forced to ignore ideals, values, morals, ethics, and principles. We have to follow realistic policy sometimes to safeguard our interests first, because no one else will come to protect your interests. And also, we may not be in a position to influence by any interference of us. If we were to interfere in another country, we may not be able to positively influence the developments. So when things are not under your control, there's no point in criticizing those governments or having a hostile relationship with them. Rather, maintain decent relations, protect your interests, and take care of your problems. Right? It's pretty much the same approach we have followed with Russia-Ukraine conflict. Right? With Russia as well, Russia being a strategic traditional partner, we have never criticized Russia openly till date for the violations it has committed in Ukraine. We have called for an end for the war, but we haven't criticized Russia or blamed Russia. We haven't voted once against Russia at the United Nations. We have abstained from all the votes. We have bypassed the Western sanctions, and we continue importing oil from Russia. Right? That again is a realistic policy of India, which we have followed from many, many decades. So irrespective of which government is in power, who's the prime minister, which is the party in power in India, we follow pretty much the same foreign policy towards Myanmar and Russia. It's a very realistic policy designed to protect India's interests. So we have consistently sidelined the human rights problem. Right? We have ignored the political situation in Myanmar, and we have tried protecting our own interests. Is that clear? Again, don't judge. There's nothing right or wrong here. It's all about protecting our country's interest first. Country's interest will come first in the world of international relations. Sometimes you can't help it. So after crushing the pro-democracy movement, the military rule continued for 2 more decades. Military junta's rule continued from 1990s till 2010. So throughout this period, India maintained very, very good relations with the military junta. We continued our close relationship with the military rule. Tomorrow, right? Sorry for the interruption. There has been a small update. Just one more announcement for tomorrow. Tomorrow you have your doubt clearing sessions for economics and geography. I reminded you yesterday as well about this. So whatever questions you have regarding last week's geography classes and economy classes, please send the doubts to IAS Live. And tomorrow we'll have a session in the morning and evening as well, where Sham sir and Mukesh sir will clear all your doubts with regard to geography and economy. All right, so please make a note. So coming back to our discussion, India has consistently maintained good ties with Myanmar, right? With whoever has formed the government. Be it the initial democratic government in 1950s, be it the military dictatorship that took root in 1962, right? We didn't criticize the crushing of the pro-democracy movement in 1980s. So till 2010, we maintained the same approach and maintained very good relations with the military junta. We even made big investments. We started many big projects. We supplied weapons. We even provided training to Myanmar. We even conducted many joint exercises and operations with Myanmar. So essentially, India went ahead and built strategic ties with Myanmar. We ignored the West. We ignored Western criticism. Western countries, they kept pointing fingers at India. US especially, right? Even some European countries, they kept pointing fingers at India to show that India was being hypocritical, right? But they were not seeing their own hypocrisy. If you look at US and European countries, they have worked with dictatorships and autocracies. They have backed governments which have committed genocides. So they were pointing fingers at India, and India ignored these criticisms. US was blaming India that despite being a democracy, we are dealing with a military rule, right? How is it any different from US dealing with Saudi Arabia or US dealing with many dictatorships in Africa and in West Asia? Just like US looks after its own interests, India was looking after its own interests. This is where our independent foreign policy becomes very, very important. Since 1947, we have followed the principle of strategic autonomy, where we maintain our independence in our foreign policy. We make those foreign policy choices which serve our interests, not the interests of some other country. Is that clear? So, in line with this, we continued the close relations with Myanmar, that is with the military dictatorship. We gave a lot of investments to the country, started many strategic projects, including connectivity projects, supplied weapons, provided military training as well to their armed forces, and even conducted joint exercises and operations with Myanmar's armed forces. So that is the close relationship that we cultivated with Myanmar in order to protect India's interests and to deal with the common security challenges. So after China, if there is any country which is influential in Myanmar, it is India. Is that clear? We may not be as influential as China because Myanmar is also a communist nation like China. It's inspired by communist ideology. So China comes always first. It has made many more big investments in Myanmar. It has given even more support to the military junta. But after China, it is India which is the most powerful, influential country in Myanmar. We have ensured this by following this policy of realpolitik, by protecting our interests, by ignoring the Western sanctions, and by continuing our close ties with Myanmar. Is that clear? And also please understand, Western countries criticizing Myanmar and cutting off ties, it's again not in the true interest of democracy or human rights. Western countries like US are not genuinely concerned about the people of Myanmar. That is not their problem. Their problem is China's influence in Myanmar. Especially during the Cold War before 1991, Western countries were countering communism. They were countering communist socialist ideology. So as Myanmar was aligned with China and Soviet Union, even Soviet Union was very influential. Even today, Russia is very influential in Myanmar. So since Myanmar has always been an ally of China and Soviet Union, that is the reason why the Western countries were targeting Myanmar. Not because they care about the people of Myanmar, not because they care about democracy or human rights. Is that clear? So given that fact, India did the right thing by pursuing a realistic policy. We maintained the good relations so that Myanmar's military junta will favor India on critical matters. In fact, it has helped India to deal with many security challenges in tackling Northeast insurgency, in curbing organized crime. Right? Myanmar's military has played a key role in assisting India. We have very close military and defense relations with Myanmar. But by 2010, Western sanctions were having an impact on the military rule. The Western sanctions were very strict. And please remember, Myanmar is blessed with resources. It has plenty of natural resources, but it was never able to exploit them to the full potential because of limited access to the Western world. Right? Just funds from China and Russia and India was not enough for Myanmar to fully exploit its natural resources and its access to the Indian Ocean. Right? Don't forget, Myanmar has plenty of resources and it has access to the Indian Ocean region. But it could never leverage the economic potential because of the impact of economic sanctions. Myanmar was cut off from Western banking and financial institutions. So Myanmar's economy was struggling by 2010. Right? The economic sanctions had an impact. The accounts and financial assets of the top army generals, they were all frozen by Western countries. So because of this economic impact, finally the military junta made a transition. In the year 2010, they made a partial transition to democracy. Partial reforms were introduced. Constitutional reforms were carried out. But it was a partial transformation. Is that clear? Because the military reserved majority seats in the parliament to itself. It allowed elections to take place after a long time. Through these constitutional reforms, electoral reforms were carried out. Direct elections were introduced, but only for very few seats. So that is not a true democracy. Right? In a true democracy, there will be free and fair elections. And majority of the seats will be elected by the people. But what Myanmar did was just a partial reform. It allowed elections to happen only for few limited seats. But majority of the seats in the parliament were reserved for military members who would be nominated by the military itself. So essentially, it was military rule in an indirect form. So since it was a partial transition, Western countries did not recognize the transformation. Western countries refused to recognize the so-called democratic reforms. They rejected this change and they did not lift the economic sanctions. Is that clear? So the sanctions continued. So this government, which was formed, lasted for 5 years until 2015. So we saw partial democracy from 2010 to 2015. This was after decades and decades of military rule. From 1962 to 2010, Myanmar was under the junta rule. Finally, partial democracy had been introduced that lasted for 5 years. It was a partially elected government, but majority of the members were still nominated by the military. So Western countries did not recognize this partial change and they did not lift the sanctions. But however, traditional friends of Myanmar like India, China, Russia, they all welcomed the change. India especially welcomed the reforms. We appreciated Myanmar for showing the interest to introduce some reforms at least. All right. But finally, Myanmar's military had to introduce complete reforms because the sanctions were affecting its economy. It was under this pressure of Western countries that Myanmar made a transition into a full democracy in 2015. In 2015, it made a full transition to another set of reforms. Full-fledged democracy was introduced and the military stepped aside, which allowed for elections to take place in the country. The elections were monitored and observed by various countries and also by various international organizations. They all certified that it was a free and fair election. And this election was won by the NLD. NLD has been a very popular political party, right? So the civilians who were frustrated with military rule, they all voted for NLD. It was all based on the image of Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi had sacrificed a lot for the people of Myanmar. She had spent years under house arrest. All right. That's why she was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Right after her house arrest, she had been awarded with Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to bring democracy in the country. So, given her popularity, NLD easily won the elections and formed a fully democratic government, an elected government that lasted for 5 years until 2020. However, Aung San Suu Kyi could not become the president because the military ensured that she cannot become the president. The military has always been insecure about her popularity. So what they did was that before introducing these reforms, they made a constitutional amendment. According to this amendment, Myanmar's president, right, whoever becomes the president, cannot be married to a foreign national. It's been made an eligibility criteria. If a president aspirant is married to a foreign national, he or she cannot become the president of Myanmar. This condition was deliberately added to target Aung San Suu Kyi because she is married to a British national. Her husband is a British citizen. So to keep her out of power, to ensure she does not become the president and become even more popular, they added an amendment before stepping down that those who are married to foreign nationals cannot aspire to be the president of the country. So Aung San Suu Kyi had to step aside and NLD came to power in 2015 and we had a fully elected government that lasted for 5 years. Aung San Suu Kyi became a state councillor. She took a ceremonial role, which is a little similar to our president, right? Something like the president of India. There is a office in Myanmar as well, the state councillor, right? State councillor is seen as a high leader, supreme leader, who will guide and advise the government without any real executive powers. So she took up such a nominal role, allowing others to lead the country. So for 5 years, Myanmar saw elected government in place. And this transition was recognized. It was recognized by Western governments. The Western governments immediately recognized the transition. They appreciated the change that had happened. And finally, the economic sanctions were lifted. The economic sanctions of Western countries was lifted. And this was great news for India. Because India would no longer be caught between Myanmar and Western countries. Previously, there was always pressure on India from US and European countries. Now, we need not make that balance. because they themselves lifted the sanctions and established ties with Myanmar. Now, this began a rush. It began a competition. It began a competition as Myanmar is a major Indo-Pacific country that is blessed with resources. For many years, Myanmar's resources were untouched because of the sanctions. So now that the sanctions were lifted and Western countries set up ties with Myanmar, there was a rush from all the countries to invest in the country, and we saw a strategic economic competition break out between the major powers. So on one hand, traditional powers like India, China were competing, and the Western countries came in. US, European countries through European Union, Japan, Australia, Russia, all these major powers, they started competing for influence in the country as Myanmar is located at a key location in the Indo-Pacific and it is blessed with resources. So for 5 years, there was some improvement happening. Politically, the country had reformed, but the internal problems persisted. Even under an elected government, we saw Rohingyas being targeted. In 2016, Rohingya Muslims were targeted by Myanmar's army under the watch of an elected government. This was a mass atrocity that was committed, which triggered the Rohingya refugee crisis. And Aung San Suu Kyi and her government did not say a word. They didn't criticize the military. So that is why there was a lot of criticism against Aung San Suu Kyi as well. There was a call given to withdraw her Nobel Peace Prize as well. But you have to understand the position of Aung San Suu Kyi. After decades of struggle and fight, they had won democracy and installed an elected government. If NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi had immediately acted against the army for Rohingya violence, right, democracy would have been squashed many years ago, right? At the beginning of this government itself, the government would have been thrown out by the military leaders and they would have retaken power. They would have recaptured power in the country. So because of this concern, Aung San Suu Kyi did not speak up for Rohingyas. She wouldn't support or publicly criticize the military. So under the watch of an elected government, mass atrocities continued. The human rights violations continued. But the positive side was that Western countries started investing in the country, which made things easier for India. India was planning a collaboration with Japan to make joint investments in order to compete with China. There was a rush for exploiting Myanmar's resources as it is a key Indo-Pacific nation, right? So this was a good period, a decently good period as far as Myanmar's internal problems were concerned. Despite all the challenges that were there, it was still a decent time for India because we no longer had to balance Western countries and our ties with Myanmar. But unfortunately, things have turned around again. In the last 2 years, the unthinkable has happened again. Fresh elections were held after 5 years because by 2020, the term of the government was over. Next round of elections had to be held, and accordingly, fresh elections were held in 2020-2021. The results which were expected, they clearly indicated another victory for NLD. It showed the rising popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi as a democratic leader. The people of Myanmar clearly were preferring democracy. They were supporting NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, and it was clearly a vote against the military. So this expected result again made the military leaders insecure. They were threatened by the rising popularity of democracy in their country. They were threatened by the popularity of NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. So what they did was, they nullified the election results. They declared the election results as void by alleging electoral fraud without any basis. Without any credible evidence or proof, the military leaders alleged that the elections had been rigged to favor NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. By making these unsubstantiated claims and allegations, they declared the results to be void and they imposed a national emergency. And they threw out the civilian government. Is that clear? So since then, Myanmar is back under military rule. Western countries again have imposed sanctions. Immediately, Western countries cut off their ties and they have brought back the economic sanctions on Myanmar, and things are back to square one. This is how quickly international relations can change. In fact, I still remember 2 years ago, I was teaching a batch just like this. I was praising the transition that had happened to democracy, explaining how things had become easier for India, how we were planning joint investment projects with Japan. And within 2 days, the military took over. Within 2 days of this discussion in a class in 2021, the military had declared national emergency and military rule was back. And the economic sanctions were back. So things were back to square one. That is how quickly international relations can change. That is how this world is dynamic. Right? That is what makes the subject very challenging as well. You have to constantly update yourself, keep in touch, understand what is happening on the ground. Right? You don't have to mug up these developments. You have to understand the dynamics. Right? Understand the motivation of Myanmar's military. What is the role of Aung San Suu Kyi? What is India's policy here? So when this change happened, again, India did not criticize. Of course, India was shocked, but we did not criticize. We brought back the same policy. We returned to our previous policy of not criticizing the military junta. Even when Rohingya crisis happened, we didn't criticize the military. We knew what the military had done. They had committed an almost genocide, killing thousands of innocent Rohingyas. Still, India did not speak a word. When democracy was wiped out and military rule was brought back, India did not say a word. We didn't criticize Myanmar even once. Because India has bigger interests at stake. We have the Chinese influence, the security problems, the border issues. So to secure these core interests of India, we need to maintain good relations with whoever is in power. For India, honestly, it doesn't matter whether it's an elected government or the military junta. Whoever is in power, we are forced to deal with them. Ideally, we prefer an elected government, yes, but things are not under our control and India would not like to interfere. We can't risk antagonizing Myanmar's military. Imagine a situation where Myanmar's military becomes hostile, like the military government in Bangladesh or like the governments of Pakistan. Right? Then Myanmar's military would openly favor China and our core interests will get compromised, affecting the stability of Northeast India. So keeping these core interests in mind, we have continued dealing with the military in the best way possible without criticizing the violations that are happening in the country. So ever since the military rule was brought back, all the political parties have united in Myanmar. The political parties, along with various indigenous tribes which are opposed to military rule, whoever opposes the military rule in the country, they have united and they have formed a national unity government to fight for democracy. Aung San Suu Kyi has again been arrested. Flimsy charges have been brought up against her. They have charged her for violating COVID-19 protocols and other such flimsy cases have been filed against her just for the sake of arresting her. And the remaining leaders and all the political parties, including NLD and few indigenous tribal groups, they have all united to form a unity government. It's like a parallel government they have announced. And they are leading pro-democracy protests which are being targeted by the military. So the pro-democracy protests have been targeted in the last 2 years. And thousands of civilians have been killed again in the last couple of years. brutal force has been used. Air strikes have been carried out. Such large-scale force is being used in Myanmar to target civilians and the political protesters. So this has created unrest in the country. It has created new problems for India. Because of the massive use of military force to target civilians and protesters, there is a direct impact on India because the refugees are fleeing to India, especially the Chin and Zo community members who are being targeted. They have fled to neighboring Manipur and Mizoram, where the state governments have given shelter to the refugees. Now, this apparently is linked to the latest crisis in Manipur. Recently, you might have heard about the deadly crisis between the Meitei majority groups, which have clashed with Kuki armed groups in Manipur, causing large-scale violence in Manipur. There has been a complete breakdown of law and order and security in Manipur, and the state government and central government and the security forces share the blame. But part of the crisis is linked to the flow of refugees, the Chin-Zo community, who have ties with the Kuki community. It's a very controversial issue because this is an allegation of the Meiteis who are in majority, right, in Manipur Valley region. They have blamed the Kukis for sheltering the Chin-Zo refugees, and they've alleged that Kukis are cultivating drugs. They've alleged that this is an allegation of the Manipur state government as well, which has the support of the Meitei community. Their allegation is that Kukis, their armed groups, their armed insurgent groups, with refugees from Myanmar, they have deforested the area and they've started cultivating drugs. These claims are denied by the Kuki community. They outright deny them as false allegations. They are saying that Meiteis are targeting them because of their age-old ethnic rivalry. Is that clear? Manipur's insurgency is deep-rooted. You will study more about this under internal security. But please understand that what happens in Myanmar does have a spillover effect. The flow of refugees into Manipur, Mizoram is linked to the current ethnic problems in Manipur. I'm not saying whether Kukis are right or Meiteis are right. Yes, it's a very complicated issue. Wrong things have been done on both the sides. Allegations have been brought up on both the sides. That's a separate issue altogether. But the point to understand here is that the flow of refugees from Myanmar, because of the political crisis, has some impact on the ethnic situation in Manipur, and it affects the security of India. Is that clear? So along with the flow of refugees, India is worried about increase in organized crime, especially the increase in the flow of drugs and arms, and the connection between these developments and insurgent outfits in the region. This is definitely a challenge for India. So that's why India has been closely watching those developments. But we haven't criticized Myanmar's military because we rely on them. We need their support to secure the border areas. Is that clear? The government of India officially denied access to refugees. The government of India said will not accept refugees from Myanmar. It even the Home Ministry directed Manipur and Mizoram to not allow refugees to enter the country. But since in Manipur and Mizoram, local tribes are connected with Chins and Zos, they have accepted the refugees even against the orders of the central government. Because it's a humanitarian crisis. They're running away to save their lives. It is a complicated human situation. So that's why you should understand that the instability in Myanmar has been India's biggest problem. Our biggest concern is about the constant crisis in the country. Problem is, it's not that we love the military rule, right? We would be more than happy to see the military rule go away and democracy taking root in the country. But unfortunately, we are forced to deal with the military. That is why we continue our close relations with the military and we don't criticize them for the violations they carry out. Is that clear? In fact, the airstrikes they are carrying out is landing in Indian territory. Recently, Myanmar's Air Force used fighter jets and helicopters to bomb civilian targets. That is a gross violation of human rights. It's a war crime. Some of these missiles that were fired by Myanmar's fighter jets. They landed in India across the border. Fortunately, it didn't cause any damage. But imagine if there were to be loss of lives on the Indian side because of missiles fired by Myanmar's forces. So this situation in Myanmar is not good for India. It's not ideal for India. So we are dealing with this persistent problem, right? It's a complex equation and situation for us. We can't openly criticize the military. At the same time, we can't deal with them easily as well, right? So this broadly explains the complex situation in Myanmar. All right. I've added all the points in the slides. Please take a look at them. Whatever we discussed, that is added in the PPT as well. So please use the annotations and the points I have added in the PPT to make proper notes on this topic. It's a expected topic for your mains exam. You can expect questions on the political situation in Myanmar and how it impacts India. Is that clear? So please understand these complex equations. That is why I have to spend more time on these topics. I have to explain the very root cause, and that takes a little bit of time. I hope everything is clear. I hope you guys have understood all the key issues related to Myanmar. Now we can proceed to the next part of the discussion. Let's continue for 15-20 minutes and we'll take a break after that. Next, we have few small topics. We will talk about the major policy initiatives of the Modi government, which is focused on Myanmar. We will discuss India's investments, our defense security relations, China's investments and China's role. We'll talk about Rohingya crisis in detail. So all these topics will be covered, and then we can wrap up India-Myanmar relations. So the Modi government has prioritized 5 policy initiatives with focus on Myanmar. One is the Act East policy, as Myanmar is a land bridge that connects India with Southeast Asia. The Neighborhood First policy also applies to Myanmar, as we share direct land borders with the country, land and maritime borders with the country. Right? So Myanmar is the only country where both the Neighborhood First and Act East policy applies. Is that clear? Again, a potential prelims question. UPSC might ask you, in which country does Act East policy and Neighborhood First policy, both, in which country does it apply? It applies only for Myanmar. Because Myanmar is a neighboring country of India, sharing immediate borders with India. And it is also a Southeast Asian country. So as a result, our Neighborhood First policy also applies, where we prioritize our ties with neighboring countries. And Act East policy also applies, where we prioritize our ties with Southeast Asian, East Asian countries. So these are the 2 policy drivers, right? This is what pushes India to pay more attention and give focus to Myanmar. Then the Buddhist Circuit initiative, which we have covered in previous classes, right? It's a cultural initiative, a soft power diplomatic initiative. We are trying to leverage our Buddhist heritage to gain influence across Asian countries. We are reviving our Buddhist pilgrimage sites like Bodh Gaya, Kushinagar, Sarnath. We are working with Nepal to revive the tourist facilities at Lumbini and other important Buddhist sites in Nepal as well. We want to attract Buddhist tourists from across Asian countries where Buddhism remains popular. So from Sri Lanka, from Bhutan, from Myanmar, from China, from Japan, from South Korea, and from across Southeast Asia. We want to attract Buddhist tourists, which will promote our Buddhist heritage and increase our soft power influence across Asian countries. So Myanmar is a beneficiary of this initiative because Myanmar also has many Buddhist pilgrimage sites. It's a Buddhist majority nation, right? So that is another initiative of India that applies to Myanmar. And we are focusing on regional connectivity. India has taken up some key infrastructure projects, connectivity projects. We are going to study these projects in detail. We have focused on strengthening border security. That is why we have prioritized our defense security relations. with Myanmar. So these are the focus areas of India currently as far as Myanmar is concerned. All right. These are the 5 focus policies and initiatives of India that drives our relations with Myanmar. Now, let me point out the importance given to Myanmar by the Modi government. We upgraded our Look East policy to Act East policy in the year 2014. And this announcement was made by the Prime Minister when he was present in Myanmar for the India-ASEAN Summit. The Look East policy of India was launched in the year 1991 under the then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. The then Narasimha Rao government had launched this initiative to improve our ties with Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. This policy, after a lot of success, has been upgraded recently into the Act East policy, which was launched by Prime Minister Modi in 2014. It's a revised version of Look East. We are giving more focus and priority to Southeast Asian and East Asian countries under the Act East policy. So this change was made and the decision was announced deliberately when the Prime Minister was in Myanmar. So what does this signify? It signifies that India was sending out a symbolic message to Myanmar. See, in international relations, symbolism or symbolic gestures that you make holds a lot of importance. For example, when Prime Minister Modi, when he took his oath in 2014, for the swearing-in ceremony, he had invited all the South Asian leaders, the SAARC leaders. And that is when India announced the Neighborhood First policy. That's a symbolic way of showing that we are going to prioritize our ties with our neighboring countries. Similarly, every year for the Republic Day parade in India, we invite a foreign leader as a chief guest. I'm sure many of you know this. We've invited the US president, the French president, the leaders of Southeast Asian countries, right? So several foreign dignitaries. Like this year, for example, we invited the leader of a country. So they are invited as chief guests to these events. Why? Because it's a symbolic gesture that India is making. It means that in the coming year, we will prioritize our ties with that country. And you will see a lot of positive improvements happening in India's relations with that country. Right? Whichever country was invited for the Republic Day parade, right? When their leader participates as a chief guest, following that, the whole year, we will give priority and focus for that country. Now, can you guys tell me who was invited this year as the chief guest for our Republic Day parade in 2023? And who was invited last year? Both are very important. In 2022, who was the Republic Day parade chief guest? And in 2023, who was invited as the chief guest? Very good. Many of you are getting the right answer for 2023. This year, we had invited the Egyptian president. The Egyptian president. Correct? Many of you have got the right answer. Very good. The current Egyptian leader, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, was invited by India as the chief guest for the parade. And you're already seeing a major improvement in India-Egypt relations. This year, we have improved our ties. Our economic relations have improved. We have signed several agreements with Egypt. We have increased our military exercises as well. Just a few days back, Indian armed forces, right, were deployed into Egypt for a multilateral military exercise. All right. So please take this as an exercise, as a small assignment. Identify the name of this military exercise that took place recently. It was hosted by Egypt, and Indian forces took part in it. Indian Air Force, right, was deployed. Indian Army, Navy, they were deployed in this military exercise. It's a major multilateral exercise hosted by Egypt. Find out the name. Find out what's the name of this military exercise. All right, it's very, very important. That's a small exercise for you. So our ties with Egypt has seen an improvement after we invited the Egyptian leader. So similarly, whom did we invite last year? Any idea? Anyone? In 2022? Nobody. It can't be nobody. Just because they weren't present physically doesn't mean we didn't invite anyone. Last year, we had invited all the Central Asian leaders. There are 5 Central Asian countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. All the 5 Central Asian leaders were invited. They were about to attend. But unfortunately, because of COVID-19, right before they could travel, a new wave started spreading. The Omicron variant started spreading, bringing back lockdown and travel restrictions. Because of that, Central Asian leaders couldn't physically attend the Republic Day parade. But however, a virtual summit was held between India and all Central Asian countries. Last year, our top focus was on Central Asia. All right, we will study this under the Central Asia topic. So what I'm trying to say is that in diplomacy, symbolism holds a lot of importance. The gestures that you make is closely watched by other countries. For example, when a new prime minister comes in, other countries watch which country will the prime minister visit. Who will be the first leader to visit India when a new government has formed in India? These are symbolic moves. It shows that these are the priority relations. So similarly, India announced the upgradation of Look East to Act East policy when Prime Minister Modi was present in Myanmar personally to participate in the India-ASEAN summit. So India was sending out a symbolic message that Myanmar is critical for us. That Myanmar is like a bridge. We see Myanmar as a bridge to Southeast Asia. That was the message being sent across from India. Essentially, India wanted to convey to Myanmar that Myanmar is crucial for our foreign policy to connect with Southeast Asia, to ensure the success of our Act East policy. So there are some important projects that we shall be discussing, including a project known as the IMT Trilateral Highway Project. We will also talk about the Kaladan project. These are 2 important connectivity projects involving India and Myanmar. Is that clear? Connectivity is a priority for us. What hampers our relations with our neighbors is the poor connectivity. This is our greatest weakness, which is preventing us from achieving regional integration. So to connect closely with our neighbors and the region beyond that, connectivity projects are crucial, such as roads, railway lines, seaports, etc. Such projects have been prioritized by India. Such connectivity projects will drive economic relations. It will improve cultural relations. The best way to bring 2 countries closer is to improve connectivity. Create more roads, create railway links, establish better maritime and air connectivity through airports and seaports, set up pipelines, improve your digital connectivity, relax your visa immigration norms. So these connectivity measures will drive trade. It will make it easier for people to move around. It will boost tourism. Correct? It will boost tourism, and thus it will promote your cultural ties, and it will bring the industry, the businessmen, the traders together. So connectivity is crucial. And this is where Myanmar becomes extremely important for India. Please pay attention to the few maps that I'm showing you. This map depicts the IMT Trilateral Highway, India, Myanmar, Thailand Trilateral Highway. It's one of the most ambitious connectivity projects India has been pursuing. Of course, it's a road project. It connects Moreh in India. Moreh is a very important commercial town. It's a border town on the India-Myanmar border, and it's a very important commercial center. Any idea in which state Moreh is located? Does anyone know in which state, in which Indian state is Moreh located? Very good, Manipur. Some of them are getting it wrong. Some are saying Assam, Nagaland, Mizoram, but few have said Manipur. Manipur is the correct answer. In Manipur, along the Myanmar border, you have this commercial trading town called Moreh. This town has historical significance. Since centuries, this has been a trading point between various ethnic tribal communities in this region. So even today, India, Myanmar use Moreh as a trading point. So from here, the highway will connect with the key cities of Myanmar, that is Mandalay and Yangon. And from here, this highway will extend to Thailand and connects with Mae Sot, thus connecting India, Myanmar, and Thailand through a land-based road project. Is that clear? It's an ongoing project. It was started many years ago under the Look East policy. It is still an ongoing project because the project has been delayed. Project has faced many hurdles. The biggest problem is Myanmar's internal crisis. The internal crisis, the security situation because of the political unrest, the Rohingya crisis, and also the impact of economic sanctions. The Indian companies that are involved have found it difficult to mobilize the funds and execute the projects. Or else, if they don't abide by the sanctions, their other projects and investments could be hit by Western countries. So the impact of sanctions, the political unrest and security situation has delayed and derailed the project. It's been going on for many, many years, but we are very, very close to completing it. We are very close to completing it and setting up full connectivity. Is that clear? In fact, there is a very ambitious proposal to extend this highway to Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. This is a vision that we have proposed under Act East policy. India has an ambitious plan to extend the IMT highway all the way till Vietnam. We have also proposed a parallel railway project. A parallel railway project has been proposed by India, which would connect New Delhi with Hanoi. Where is Hanoi located? Anyone in the comments? Where is the city of Hanoi located? Which country? Correct, it's in Vietnam. So India has a grand proposal under Act East policy. If we complete IMT highway connecting Myanmar and Thailand, we have a proposal with ASEAN countries to extend this road to Laos, Cambodia, all the way till Vietnam. And Vietnam is a strategic partner of India. We have very close defense security relations and economic relations with Vietnam. Parallel to this road, we have proposed a railway project. Right next to the highway, there will be a parallel railway line connecting New Delhi with Hanoi in Vietnam. This may take many more decades, but if we realize this vision, it will bring us directly to South China Sea. Essentially, it will allow India to counter the Chinese dominance in South China Sea. If China can meddle in Indian Ocean and counter Indian influence, then India can also try and counter Chinese influence by extending its influence to South China Sea. So these two projects are critical in the future. If we can extend this road and build a parallel railway line, it will bring us closer to all these countries and we will directly reach South China Sea. Right? That could become one way of countering Chinese influence in the region, just like China tries to counter Indian influence in the Indian Ocean. Is that clear? So please remember this project. It's very, very important. We spoke about BCIM corridor in the previous class. No need to repeat that. Next, we will study the Kaladan project. We will take up Kaladan project, but after a short break. Let's take a 15 minutes break. Let's come back by 7:1 and we will resume the discussion by talking about Kaladan project and the few remaining topics. Right? So very soon we can complete this chapter on Myanmar. So I'll see you back in 15 minutes. Hello everyone, welcome back to the session. Now let's continue with the connectivity projects that we were discussing. Let's talk about the Kaladan project. The Kaladan project is another important topic for your prelims, even for your mains. The full name of this project is the Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Corridor. As the name itself indicates, this project involves multiple modes of transportation. It's not just a road project, right? It involves multiple modes of transportation. So that's why it's called Multimodal Transit Transport Corridor. So let's see the alignment of this project. Let's see the important places that it connects and what forms of transportation are used for this connectivity. Under this project, there is a maritime link. There is a maritime link in the Bay of Bengal that connects the Kolkata Haldia port in West Bengal with the Sitwe port that you can see here in the map. Please note down the name and location of this important port in Myanmar. It's a strategic port that opens to the Bay of Bengal, and it is located in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. It's present in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, and this port has been built by India with Indian funds. India has invested in the strategic Sitwe port, and we have created a maritime link from the Kolkata Haldia port to the Sitwe port. This link was recently opened just a couple of months ago. The Kaladan link, at least a part of this link was opened. The sea link to Sitwe port has been operationalized. Is that clear? The Sitwe port has been made operational. So the plan under Kaladan project is to send goods from India, from the east coast of India, preferably from Kolkata Haldia port, to the Sitwe port in Myanmar. From here, the goods will be taken via the Kaladan river, where an inland navigation route has been created. This is still an ongoing project, and the project is named after the Kaladan river. Kaladan is a river in Myanmar. It flows down from India, from Mizoram. The Kaladan river flows down from India into Myanmar and drains into Bay of Bengal. So on the Kaladan river, for around 158 kilometers, there is an inland navigation route which is being created, where the goods can be taken from Sitwe port via this river network right up to the end of the Kaladan river. In the final stretch, there is a highway. There is a 129-kilometer road which is under construction that will connect this project back to India, back to Mizoram. So this project will not only improve our connectivity with Myanmar, it will not just improve the link between India and Myanmar, it will also create alternate access to Northeast India. Is that clear? It connects with Mizoram via Myanmar, thereby allowing us to bypass the Siliguri corridor. Yesterday, we studied about connectivity projects with Bangladesh, how transit through Bangladesh can give us alternate access to Northeast India. Similarly, the Kaladan project can give us alternate access to Mizoram and northeastern states via Myanmar. So this strategic project has been pursued by India since the Look East policy, and we are continuing it under Act East policy. All right? But unfortunately, the project has faced a lot of delays and hurdles. many challenges have affected this project. There have been funding issues from India because of the economic sanctions. The sanctions have affected the funding. All right. Then the security situation in Rakhine state, especially the Rohingya crisis. Rohingyas are found in the Rakhine state, where the Sitwe port and Kaladan river is located. So the crisis involving the targeting of Rohingyas and the large-scale violence that broke out here has affected and derailed the project. And there are also few insurgent groups. There are few insurgents near the border who have threatened and targeted the project. Along the Mizoram-Myanmar border over here, few insurgents have tried targeting the construction of this project. So all these issues have led to multiple delays, and the present political crisis has added to the problems. The political crisis, which is going on from the last 2 years, has further made it difficult for Indian companies to continue with the project. So India's Adani Ports is involved in the Sitwe project. It's playing a key role. But completing this whole link has become a challenge because of the sanctions, the security problems, and the political situation. So it's still an uncompleted project. It's only partially opened. Recently, we opened up the Sitwe port and operationalized the link, but the rest of the link is not complete. Is that clear? So these are two major connectivity projects that India is pursuing with Myanmar. Now let us compare this with China's investments. Let us see where China stands in Myanmar as far as such projects are concerned. China has built and executed the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, or CMEC project, which is one of the key components of its Belt and Road Initiative. China's Belt and Road Initiative involves many components around the world. One of the key components is with Myanmar, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. China has completed this corridor. It has operationalized this corridor already. Through this economic corridor, China is connecting its Yunnan province and its capital, Kunming, which is a major industrial center, with the Rakhine state, where China has built a strategic port known as the Kyoukphu port. Please note down the name and location of this port as well. You can see the Kyoukphu port over here. It's located just a few kilometers to the south of Sitwe port, which has been built by India. So China has built the Kyoukphu port in the Rakhine state, and it is connecting Kunming from the Yunnan province through a road and rail corridor. It has built highways, railway network. It has built pipelines to transport oil and gas from Bay of Bengal. Because in Bay of Bengal, you have hydrocarbon reserves. And China is already exploiting the hydrocarbon reserves with Myanmar. China has built oil-gas pipelines where it is extracting oil and gas from the Bay of Bengal and transporting it through Myanmar directly into the Yunnan province. It is even setting up industrial clusters and connecting these projects with all major cities like Mandalay and Yangon. So China is way ahead of India when it comes to connectivity with Myanmar. When India is struggling to complete one road and one multimodal link, China has executed multiple such projects. Is that clear? Even though India has completed the Sitwe port, China has not just built the Kyoukphu port, but it has completed the road rail corridor. It has set up oil gas pipelines. It is creating industrial clusters. It is even setting up power plants along this corridor. So essentially, China has invested billions and billions of dollars into Myanmar. That is why China shares such a close relationship with Myanmar's military. China even supplies weapons to Myanmar's military. It's a major weapon supplier. China also gives diplomatic support to Myanmar to overcome Western sanctions and criticism. At the United Nations, at International Criminal Court, Myanmar is facing very serious charges. War crimes have been brought up against Myanmar at the International Criminal Court. At the United Nations, Myanmar is repeatedly discussed. Myanmar has been blacklisted by FATF, by the Financial Action Task Force. It has been blacklisted for failing to act against money laundering and terror financing. So since Myanmar faces a lot of diplomatic challenges, especially from Western countries, China provides diplomatic support to Myanmar to counter the Western pressure. That is the close relationship China shares with this country. And the reason why China has given so much attention and focus to these infrastructure projects is because through Myanmar, China will get direct access to the Indian Ocean region. Please note down this point. The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor is extremely crucial under the Belt and Road Initiative because through this project, China can directly link with Indian Ocean and it can bypass its weakness, which is the Malacca Strait. Remember, in the first class, I had showed you the Strait of Malacca, which is sandwiched between Singapore and Indonesia, right? The Malacca Strait is somewhere over here, below Thailand and Malaysia, near Singapore and Indonesia. This is the only opening for China to reach Indian Ocean. If China has to procure oil and gas from West Asian countries, right? China is also a major oil importer like India. Even China doesn't have much of hydrocarbon reserves. It's heavily dependent on oil and gas imports. Most of the supplies come from West Asian countries. So these oil gas supplies which are headed to China, they move across Indian Ocean and they enter the Malacca Strait and then reaches the South China Sea. So this is a major shipping route for China. Chinese economy is heavily dependent on this shipping route, right? A lot of China's exports and imports passes through Malacca Strait. But as you know, Malacca Strait is a choke point. It is a maritime choke point. And China has a fear that its rivals might impose a naval blockade at Malacca Strait. China's rivals, such as United States or India, both of them have the capabilities. They have the naval resources to block out Malacca Strait, which could cripple China's economy. As I told you in a previous class, US has a major military base in the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia. From here, US can quickly deploy its naval vessels and block out Malacca Strait in case of tensions with China. Similarly, India, in case of a conflict or escalation of border tensions with China, India can punish China by blocking out the Malacca Strait. We have a very strong military presence at the Andaman Nicobar Islands in the Andaman Sea. India has a Tri-Services Command where the Indian Army, Navy and Air Force are all deployed under a single unified command. So here the Indian Navy, with the support of the Navy and Air Force, the Army and the Air Force, can impose a naval military blockade at Malacca Strait to put pressure on China. So China has always feared losing access to Indian Ocean because of its weakness at Malacca Strait. That is why China is pursuing 3 major projects to bypass Malacca Strait. For China, it is critical to have access to Indian Ocean. And it is desperately trying to bypass Malacca Strait. And for that, it is pursuing 3 projects. One is China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. You can see here in the map very clearly. Through this corridor, China can directly access Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean without depending on Malacca Strait. Even other shipments which are headed to China and China's exports can be brought to Kyofu port. And from here directly, China can trade with the other countries in the Indian Ocean. It need not depend on Malacca Strait. Is that clear? That is why this corridor, the CMEC corridor, is of great significance to China under the Belt and Road Initiative. Apart from this, there are two more projects China is pursuing to directly access the Indian Ocean. Does anyone know which are those two projects? Can you let me know in the comments? Apart from CMEC, there are two more vital projects that China is pushing for. Its idea is to directly access Indian Ocean without depending on Malacca Strait. Which are these projects? Only one student has got it right. Only one student, Pratyaksh. He has correctly mentioned both the answers, both the projects. Others are only mentioning one of them. Okay, let me give you the answer. The second project is CPEC corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which will connect China's Xinjiang province, which is to the north of Jammu and Kashmir. Xinjiang will be directly connected with Balochistan in Pakistan. In Balochistan, you have a strategic port called the Gwadar port. Right? In the Balochistan region of Pakistan, you have a strategic port called Gwadar port in the Arabian Sea, which China has funded and constructed. So from Xinjiang, China can directly reach Gwadar port and Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf and thus access Indian Ocean. It need not depend on Malacca Strait. There is one more project China is interested in. This project is located in Thailand. In Thailand, you have the Kra Isthmus. Isthmus is a narrow land, a very narrow piece of land that is dividing two large water bodies. Just like a strait is a narrow water body dividing two large land bodies, isthmus is a narrow land corridor dividing two large water bodies. Now you observe the map here. This is the country of Thailand. Thailand becomes very narrow at this stretch. It's a very narrow country here. This is where the Kra Isthmus is located. Kra Isthmus or the Isthmus of Kra. It basically divides the Gulf of Thailand and Andaman Sea. It's right next to our Andaman Nicobar Islands. China's plan is to cut the land here and build an artificial canal called the Kra Canal. Just like the Suez Canal has been built in Egypt, in the Sinai Desert region, right, which connects Red Sea with Mediterranean Sea. Or just like the Panama Canal has been built near Central America and South America, which connects Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Similarly, China has an ambitious project in mind, which is to cut open Thailand in between and create a small canal, artificial man-made canal, that will allow ships to pass through from Gulf of Thailand directly into Andaman Sea. These are the three projects that China is pursuing to reduce its dependency on the Malacca Strait. That is why the CMEC corridor is so important for China, and recently it has operationalized this route. Last year, China started shipments. It started sending goods through this route. Is that clear? China has increased its strategic and military presence in Bay of Bengal and in the Indian Ocean. And this is a direct threat and a direct concern for India. All right? In fact, Myanmar has a small group of islands called the Coco Islands. The Coco Islands of Myanmar. It's located to the north of our Andaman Nicobar Islands. When India-Myanmar demarcated their maritime boundary, Coco Islands fell under Myanmar's sovereignty. Based on historical claims and international rules, Coco Islands, it was given to Myanmar, right? And this is where our maritime boundary passes through as well, between India and Myanmar. So right next to our Andaman Nicobar Islands, the strategic island group is present called Coco Islands. And according to reports, Myanmar has given China access to the Coco Islands. It is believed that Myanmar has leased Coco Islands to China, and reportedly China has set up surveillance infrastructure at Coco Islands. It can carry out electronic interception. It can monitor all the military activities of India across Bay of Bengal through this intelligence facility located at Coco Islands. See, Bay of Bengal is crucial for India. We have many major strategic military sites on this region, right? We have the missile testing range of DRDO in Odisha. At Balsor, we have the APJ Abdul Kalam Islands, where DRDO tests all the ballistic missiles of India. At Vishakhapatnam, we have a major naval base, and this is where our nuclear-powered submarines, the Arihant class submarines, are stationed. That is where they are being built. INS Arihant and the entire Arihant class of nuclear-powered submarines are being built and stationed here at Vishakhapatnam. Sriharikota is our spaceport, right, from where ISRO launches all the satellites, including military satellites. Then we have many other important military bases and nuclear power plants as well on this coastline. We have Kalpakam, Kundankulam. Then at Andaman Nicobar, we have a tri-service military command. So many such important military and strategic sites of India are present here, and the increasing presence of China is a major threat for India. This is a reason why we need good relations with Myanmar at any cost. It's believed that Myanmar has leased Coco Islands to China, and China reportedly uses the Coco Islands for surveillance against India. Is that clear? And it is pursuing so many projects to directly reach and access Indian Ocean, which further restricts India's options. So that is the reason why India has a necessity to remain close to Myanmar. It's not that we like the military government in China, in Myanmar, right? We are forced to deal with them because of these concerns that China brings to us. So as a result, India also has built very close defense relations with Myanmar's armed forces. We have supplied weapons. Recently, we gifted an old Russian submarine to Myanmar's Navy. Recently, just last year, the Indian Navy decommissioned an old Russian submarine, and we have gifted this submarine to Myanmar's Navy. This increases the maritime capabilities of Myanmar. Is that clear? We conduct joint military exercises with their army and navy. These exercises are known as IMBAX and IMNEX. Kindly remember the names of such military exercises. We have even provided training to their armed forces. We even conduct joint operations and exercises when necessary. So that is the kind of close security relations that we share with Myanmar. Is that clear? Recently, we conducted a joint counter-insurgency, counter-terrorist operation known as Operation Sunrise 1 and Operation Sunrise 2. Two such operations were carried out along the border, which targeted several northeast insurgent groups that operate along the India-Myanmar border. There are several insurgent groups that are a threat for both India and Myanmar because they have connections on the other side with Myanmar. So India and Myanmar jointly conducted a counter-insurgency operation. Just 3-4 years back, we conducted Operation Sunrise 1 and Sunrise 2 to target these insurgent outfits. It was under these operations that we targeted the insurgents present and armed groups present in Mizoram who were targeting the Kaladan project. Remember, I told you earlier that few armed groups near Mizoram border, they have targeted the Kaladan project. That's one reason why the project was delayed. So such armed groups and insurgent groups and criminal organizations present near the border, they were targeted under Operation Sunrise 1 and Sunrise 2. Myanmar has even allowed India to conduct cross-border operations. We conducted a surgical strike inside Myanmar in 2015, an insurgent group known as NSCN-K, NSCN Kaplang faction, which is a major Northeast insurgent outfit of the Nagas, was targeted by Indian special forces inside Myanmar's territory. If you guys have seen the movie Uri, which deals with Uri surgical strikes in Pakistan, the movie begins with a scene. The opening scene of the movie is set in the northeast of India. That opening scene is based on a real incident which happened in 2015. Again, if you remember the movie, right, there is an Indian army convoy passing through near the Myanmar border, and the convoy is blown up. Many Indian soldiers are killed. This is a real terror attack which happened in 2015, which was carried out by NSCN Kaplang faction. They targeted the Indian army because India had signed a framework agreement for a peace accord with other NSCN factions. We were starting the Naga peace process. So this insurgent group, which still operates from Myanmar, was opposed to the peace process. It opposed the framework agreement on the Naga peace accord. So to show their dissent and retaliate against India and the other groups that were negotiating with India, NSCN Kaplang targeted the Indian army near Manipur. All right. So this was a major attack. Several Indian soldiers were martyred. Following this major strike, the Indian army retaliated by using the para commandos, the para special forces. They were infiltrated into Myanmar and they struck the camps of NSCN Kaplang. So this was a surgical strike carried out by the Indian forces. Of course, we keep Myanmar in the loop. Myanmar has been a close friend. In the past as well, such cross-border operations have been allowed by Myanmar. Our ties are so close that Myanmar often allows Indian forces to cross over the border at least few kilometers inside to target these terror camps that are located on the other side. So we have very close intelligence sharing. We share intelligence with each other and we cooperate in conducting counter-insurgency, counter-terrorist operations. Is that clear? So this explains the close defense security relations between the two countries. And we even help Myanmar in hydrographic surveys. We help conduct hydrographic surveys, create these maps, and we share it with friendly countries like Myanmar. I hope you know what's a hydrographic survey. It's an underwater survey done in the seas and the oceans. Just like we have a terrain and topography on the land, even underwater, right, the seabed is not flat. You will have mountains, you will have valleys and trenches. So it's very important to understand the terrain underwater. If you have to deploy your naval ships and submarines, right, the Navy should understand and know the terrain present underwater. For this, underwater surveys are done, which are known as hydrographic surveys. It's done using sonar technology. So ships equipped with the mapping equipment, they scan the bottom of the sea floor and create a map, an underwater map. This is critical for naval deployment. These hydrographic maps are crucial for naval deployment, especially to deploy submarines. It also helps in resource mapping. These surveys also help in exploiting the resources present on the sea floor. So India, which has the technology, we conduct hydrographic surveys across Indian Ocean and share the maps with other friendly countries. They allow us to conduct the survey, right? So it will help our Indian Navy to deploy ships and submarines to counter Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. And since they are allowing these surveys to be conducted, we provide the maps free to the other countries as well. All right. So we give this assistance to Myanmar. We have done the same with Maldives. Recently, we finished the hydrographic survey near Maldives and we shared those maps with Maldivian Defense Forces. We provide these services to Mauritius, Seychelles, even Sri Lanka. So all these friendly countries in Indian Ocean, they are assisted by India in their hydrographic surveys. So this explains the close security defense relations with special focus on border security. The focus is mainly to strengthen the border here, to plug the gaps, to target organized crime, which is very rampant from the Golden Triangle region, to target the drug traffickers, arms traffickers. They have connections with the insurgent and terror groups. So tackling these threats has become the priority for India, and that's why we need Myanmar's support. Is that clear? Now, do you know which is the border guarding force from India? Can you guys mention in the comments? Which is the force India has deployed along the Myanmar border? BSF is responsible for Bangladesh border. We studied that yesterday. SSB for Nepal and Bhutan's border. Which is the border guarding force here? Very good. Assam Rifles. Assam Rifles is the border guarding force along the India-Myanmar border. Understood? So this brings us to the last topic in this chapter. We shall focus on Myanmar's ethnic problems, specifically the Rohingya crisis. You should understand what the Rohingya issue is all about. How does it affect India? What has been India's position on the Rohingya crisis? Right? So these are various points we need to discuss. So let me open a map. Let me familiarize you with the location where the crisis is seen, and then we'll have a detailed discussion on this. The Rohingya community, the Rohingyas, they are ethnic Muslims, and today they are found in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. You already know where the Rakhine state is located. That is where India, China have built their strategic ports, the Sitwe port and Kyokfu port, respectively. So this here is the Rakhine state. You can see in the map, it opens to Bay of Bengal. So India, China have major investments in the state. And in modern times, in the modern era, this is where you find Rohingya Muslims. It's a native ethnic community from this region. But historically, if you look at their history, if you go back 300, 400 years in time, you will see that Rohingyas were present in the Chittagong region, in the Chittagong Cox's Bazar region, which today is present in Bangladesh. Is that clear? There were few Muslim kingdoms in the region that ruled over these parts of India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, right? So back then, Rohingyas were essentially from Chittagong, Cox's Bazar region, from this area essentially. That is next to the Rakhine region. Is that clear? The Rohingyas were traditionally merchants. They were traders. And as a result, they were quite wealthy. They were well settled. They were influential. They were playing a key role in trade between the Indian subcontinent and West Asia and Southeast Asia. Right? In historical times, during medieval period, Rohingyas were vital in the trade link. They were acting as merchants and traders and enabling the maritime link from West Asia to Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. So as a result, they became very wealthy and influential. But over a period of time, as the politics and society kept changing in this region, Rohingyas, they didn't have a good future in the Chittagong Cox's Bazar area. So they shifted from here and moved out, and they settled in Rakhine region, which today belongs to Myanmar. So this was a natural historical migration, right? Where Rohingyas moved from Chittagong Cox's Bazar, they moved south and settled in Rakhine. So back then, when Rohingyas moved, these countries didn't even exist. These boundaries didn't exist. There was no India, no Bangladesh, no Myanmar. Correct? We had different kingdoms and empires, then came colonial rule, and then came independence where these countries were born. So after independence, Myanmar, which was heavily influenced by radical Buddhists, started targeting the Rohingyas. There was resentment amongst the radical factions of the Buddhists. They couldn't tolerate the prosperous Rohingya community. At one point, they were prosperous. So there has been a age-old rivalry and resentment between the two communities. And after Myanmar was born, especially after it came under military rule in 1962, so from 1960s, the radical Buddhists, they started targeting the community with the help of the military. They were declared as stateless. Essentially, their citizenship was taken away. Myanmar introduced changes in its citizenship laws and declared that Rohingyas don't belong to Myanmar. Myanmar said they belong to Pakistan. Because don't forget, even Bangladesh didn't exist in 1960s. It was East Pakistan. So Myanmar put their responsibility on Pakistan by saying that historically they are from Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, which today is in East Pakistan. So they declared that Rohingyas are not the responsibility of Myanmar. They disenfranchised an entire community based on their religion. This was nothing but communally targeting a community. Is that clear? So the blame and the responsibility was put on East Pakistan, which was later shouldered by Bangladesh. After Bangladesh became independent, Bangladesh had to deal with this burden. Now, obviously, right, no country will accept such policies of another country. If a country is disenfranchising an entire community, taking away their citizenship, and trying to push them into another country based on historical claims, no one can accept that. So Bangladesh denied to take responsibility. And Myanmar began persecuting the Rohingyas who were trapped in Rakhine. The radical Buddhists and Myanmar's army, they began targeting the community. First, they were discriminated. They were oppressed through such discriminatory policies, and then began targeted violence against the community. Is that clear? So since many decades, from 70s and 80s itself, Rohingyas have been persecuted. They have fled the region because of this targeted violence and oppression, and they've sought refuge in neighboring countries. So they have tried going back to Chittagong, Cox's Bazar area as refugees. They have tried entering India to seek refuge and protection. They even take the risky sea route, right? It's a humanitarian tragedy what happens here. Not many of you know about this. The Rohingyas who have no future, their families, their lives are not safe. From many years, they take these risky sea routes. They pay the local fishing boats or human traffickers, and they make a risky sea route through Bay of Bengal, through Andaman Sea, to try and reach Thailand or Malaysia. Many of these boats, they crash, right? They suffer accidents. The whole boat will drown, killing all the people on board. It is similar to what happens in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean Sea as well, you might have heard how refugees from Africa and West Asia try to run away. They take the help of human traffickers, pay them money to help them cross the Mediterranean to enter Greece or Italy or Spain, Portugal, or any European country. Right? Many boats, they suffer accidents, they sink, killing hundreds of people. Every year, hundreds of people are killed in the Mediterranean. Similarly, in the Andaman Sea as well, in Bay of Bengal, several Rohingyas lose their lives because they take the risk of trying entering either Bangladesh or India, Thailand, Malaysia, or sometimes Sri Lanka and Maldives. Is that clear? Many such accidents have happened. So this is not a new issue. It's been there from many decades. But recently, the issue escalated. Recently, there was a very big escalation in 2012 and 2016. What happened was, some of the Rohingyas who have been the victims of this oppression and violence, they became radicalized. See, otherwise, Rohingyas are a peaceful community. They have stayed away from radicalism because historically the community has done well. But now that they faced decades of persecution, violence at the hands of Myanmar's army, government, and the radical Buddhists, some of the victims of this communal ethnic violence, they became radicalized. So to retaliate, they set up a terrorist organization known as ARSA. It stands for Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. The Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, also known as ARSA. It's a Rohingya terrorist outfit formed by some of the radicalized Rohingyas. So ARSA started targeting Myanmar. As a part of the retaliation, it would attack Myanmar's army, it would attack Buddhist sites. So the terror attacks were going up, and Myanmar's army retaliated by launching so-called counter-terror operations. In 2012 and 16, there were few attacks carried out by ARSA, and by using these attacks as an excuse, the army, with the support of radical Buddhists, they unleashed massive violence against the entire community. They justified it under the name of a counter-terror operation. They said they were targeting ARSA. Yes, ARSA is a terrorist outfit, no doubt. It is a radicalized terrorist organization. It has carried out terror attacks. But in the name of targeting a terror group, you can't single out and target an entire community. That is what Myanmar has done. It was nothing short of a genocide that happened here. It was an attempt at ethnic cleansing, to remove an entire community, to wipe out an entire ethnic group with targeted violence. In 2012, there were large-scale communal riots between the Rohingyas and Buddhists. And in 2016, the army also got in, and in the name of counter-terror operations, they targeted Rohingya villages in Rakhine state. Entire villages were burnt. Even women and children were killed. So thousands and thousands of Rohingyas were slaughtered. And that's the reason why the UN and global organizations, they have labeled Rohingyas as the world's most persecuted community right now. Their lives have been turned upside down. For generations, Rohingyas have suffered. So the UN and other human rights organizations like Amnesty International, it's a global NGO that works in the field of human rights. You also have Human Rights Watch. All these are major global NGOs working in the field of human rights. So all these organizations have documented the atrocities committed. They have collected evidence to show what atrocities have happened. Because Myanmar had shut off the media, right? It wouldn't allow access to any country or any institution. But these agencies have brought evidence to show that nothing short of a genocide and ethnic cleansing was carried out. Thousands of Rohingyas were killed during these violent incidents, which triggered a massive refugee crisis. There was a fresh refugee crisis triggered, and Rohingyas had no other option but to run away with their families to save themselves. And they sought refuge in Bangladesh, in India, and the other countries. Is that clear? So this is the Rohingya crisis. Now, what is India's policy towards Rohingya refugees? Let's understand that. What is India's policy towards Rohingya refugees? See, according to the Ministry of Home Affairs, which deals with internal security, around 40,000 Rohingya refugees have entered India between 1970s and 2016. That is before the latest crisis happened, right? Before the latest clash in 2016. In the previous 30 to 40 years, because of constant oppression and persecution, around 40,000 Rohingyas have managed to illegally cross over, right? They're not illegal migrants. Please understand. You should know the difference between a refugee and an illegal migrant. All right? Let me tell you the difference as well. Refugee is someone who is running away from a country to save their lives. There is a risk to their life, either because of war, conflict, civil wars, or a targeted ethnic cleansing campaign by the government, right? Or there could be a natural disaster as well. So when people are running away from their country, crossing borders to another country, asking asylum, asking protection, they are refugees. They are trying to save their lives. So protecting refugees is an international obligation. Every country has some sort of the obligation or the other to protect refugees. All right, refugees are not illegal migrants. They are crossing the borders because they have no other option. If they stay back, they will die. Their families will be killed. They'll be slaughtered. So those who run away from countries, from such wars, conflicts, or civil wars or disasters to save themselves, they are refugees. There are international laws and conventions that protect refugees and places obligations on countries to protect them. Whereas illegal migrants are those who are crossing the border illegally and entering a country for a better life, like Bangladeshi illegal migrants, Indian illegal migrants entering European countries, entering Canada, entering US or Australia, right? That is illegal migration. Mexicans, from Central America, South America, right? A lot of people try to cross over to US illegally. They are illegal migrants. They have no threat to their life. They are entering another country, crossing the border illegally without a visa because they want a better life. They want better jobs. They want a better livelihood. So those who go for improving their standard of living, those who are not eligible for a legal visa, they may not have the right education. They may not have enough money with them, right? You can't get visa to developed countries and other big countries unless you have certain criteria, right? You should be skilled, you should be well educated, right? You should have enough bank balance as well. Unless you contribute to their country, they'll not give you a visa. So they are not eligible for a visa because they are poor people, uneducated or semi-skilled. So such people try to cross over illegally into other countries to find a better life. They are illegal migrants. They become a burden on the country. So India receives illegal migrants from Bangladesh and other countries. Indians go as illegal migrants to many European countries and US. Is that clear? So no country can tolerate illegal migration. That becomes a major economic and social burden. But accepting refugees is a humanitarian duty because these people are running away to save their lives. So previously, India had never blocked or prohibited Rohingyas from entering the country. We didn't encourage them to come to India as well. We didn't have any policy towards Rohingyas where we accepted Rohingya refugees and gave them refugee status. At the same time, India had not prohibited them as well. So if somehow they crossed over the border and came to India, they would settle down in various parts of the country and they would take refuge in India. So India has never officially recognized Rohingyas as refugees in the country. But previous policy was we wouldn't stop them. No direct prohibition or ban on the entry of Rohingyas. This was largely on humanitarian grounds. So according to the Home Ministry, around 40,000 Rohingyas have come to India in the previous decades and settled in Jammu and Kashmir, in Delhi, Hyderabad, and Northeast India. This is where you find a significant chunk of the Rohingya refugee population in India. But in 2016, when the latest crisis happened, the government of India changed its policy. And this became a big controversy. It's a controversial, debatable policy of the Indian government. India said we will ban the entry of Rohingyas. Even though it's physically impossible because our borders are not fenced, right? Physically, it's impossible to prevent if someone is illegally crossing over. Even though you have border security in place, it's not that your troops are present everywhere, right? There will be gaps. They might sneak through. But the government said our policy is we don't allow Rohingya refugees. This was labeled as a hostile policy by the critics because the human rights of Rohingyas was being ignored. India's tradition of protecting refugees was being ignored. So this is where India faced criticism, both within the country and from abroad. India faced a lot of criticism for this hostile policy. Is that clear? Because India has a rich history and tradition of accepting and protecting refugees. We took in the Tibetan refugees, the Tibetan Buddhists, when they fled China's oppression, right? Including the Dalai Lama, they came down to India asking for India's protection. So we accommodated all the Tibetan refugees and they have settled in India. We have taken in Sri Lankan Tamil refugees. We understood how Bengali refugees were accommodated in 1971. We have taken in Afghan refugees. Is that clear? So India has a history of accepting refugees on the grounds of human rights. But for the first time, India was explicitly prohibiting and denying the entry of refugees. So this issue reached the Supreme Court as well. The National Human Rights Commission had already issued a notice. The United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they were all critical of India. They criticized India's policy. So there was a case filed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court asked the government, what is the basis for denying them entry? On what basis are you denying Rohingyas entry into India? Because they're refugees, they're facing a life threat, right? India has a history of protecting them. We have obligations as well, right? Under a few international conventions to protect refugees. Even the Constitution, right? The Indian Constitution provides right to life as a fundamental right. And please remember, right to life under Article 21 is not just for Indian citizens. It's available to foreigners as well. Right to life cannot be taken away by the government without following the procedure established by law. So since we don't have any law or policy towards refugees, the Supreme Court questioned, on what basis are you denying Rohingyas entry into the country? Is it on the basis of religion? Is it just because Rohingyas are Muslims? So what the government said was, the government said that Rohingyas are a security threat to India. This was the government's argument. Now let's have a balanced discussion on this. According to the government of India, I'm presenting the government side, then we'll look at the other side of the argument. According to the government, there is a valid concern here because some of the Rohingyas, they do have a terrorist outfit called ARSA, Tarakan Rohingya Salvation Army. And according to intelligence reports, according to RAW and IB, ARSA has connections with Lashkar-e-Toiba, Al-Qaeda, and even with Pakistan's ISI. There is a nexus between major terrorist organizations like Lashkar, Al-Qaeda, and even Pakistan's intelligence agency reportedly has contacts with ARSA. So there is every reason for ARSA to target India. This is a valid argument from the government. There is a motivation that exists for ARSA to attack India because, one, India has never criticized Myanmar's army. Instead, we have built good relations with them, given them weapons. So obviously, ARSA will be angry, right? It's Myanmar's army which has targeted the Rohingyas. And India has never criticized Myanmar's army. We have built good relations, given them funds, given weapons to them. We have very close relations with the military junta. That itself is a reason why ARSA could attack India. Plus, India is the birthplace of Buddhism. There are many important Buddhist sites. Radical Buddhists have committed atrocities against Rohingyas. So ARSA might try to attack Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India. In fact, it has made one attempt at Bodh Gaya. It was a failed attack at Bodh Gaya in Bihar, and Indian agencies linked this failed attack with ARSA from Myanmar. right? So since India has many Buddhist sites, ARSA might target India. Plus, India became hostile to Rohingyas during the recent crisis. India explicitly prohibited their entry, right? Even this could make India a target for ARSA. So there are three reasons why ARSA might target India. Because of our close friends or friendly relations with Myanmar's army, the presence of Buddhist sites in India, and the prohibition on entry of Rohingya refugees. So this argument is in a way acceptable that yes, some of the Rohingyas might be a threat. But what the government said was all Rohingyas are a threat. The community itself is a threat. This is where the Supreme Court criticized the Indian government. The Supreme Court said you can't label the whole community as a threat. See, we accept ARSA is a threat. ARSA is a terrorist organization. There is no doubt about it. It poses a threat to India, but doesn't mean you label the whole community as a threat. But Supreme Court didn't intervene because it's a foreign policy matter. The court didn't want to step into this executive's jurisdiction. But it criticized the government of India and reminded the government of its constitutional obligations. Internationally, we face criticism from UN and human rights organizations. There, India said that we have no obligation to accept refugees because India is not a signatory. India is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. India has not signed the 1967 Additional Protocol to the Refugee Convention. All right, this is true. We have not signed the Refugee Convention of 1951. We have not signed the Additional Protocol to it. Is that clear? This Refugee Convention, when it was brought out in 1951, it mainly dealt with European refugees arising out of the Second World War. When the Second World War ended, there were millions of refugees in Europe. So Refugee Convention was adopted specifically for European refugees in the World War context. So given this fact, right, and also it places obligations on countries which sign them. Countries have to mandatorily accept refugees, give them some basic rights and privileges, and it also places some duties on refugees as well. Like, for example, countries have to take refugees and give them basic facilities, give them food, medicines, housing and clothing, secure livelihood and jobs for them, right? Officially, they have to be recognized as refugees. The status has to be given and basic facilities has to be extended. And refugees also, they have an obligation. They have to follow the law of the country. They can't break the laws. They can't get involved in crime. They can't get involved in terrorism. They can't get involved in any kind of illegal activities. So those duties are also placed on refugees through the convention. But India did not sign the convention for two reasons. This convention was initially specific to Europe. And second, we are located in South Asia where there are multiple problems in our neighboring countries. If we sign the convention, it becomes an obligation on India to accept refugees each time. So India didn't want to fall under that burden. See, we have taken refugees on our own. We took in Tibetan refugees. We took in Afghan, Sri Lankan, then Pakistani refugees. So we have a rich history of doing it. But we have done this on our own will. We don't want to do this out of force, right? Because taking in large number of refugees can become an economic and social burden. All right, this is a very important topic. European countries are also dealing with this impact. In Europe, through the refugee route, terrorists have sneaked into Europe, carried out many terror attacks. Islamic State has misused the refugee route, and by disguising themselves as refugees, they've entered European countries, carried out many major attacks in the last 10 years. In Paris, in Berlin, in UK, in Germany, right, in Belgium, many terror attacks have happened. Crime and social issues have increased, divisions have increased, communal divisions in Europe. In fact, dealing with refugees and migrants has become a major electoral issue in Europe. So accepting refugees and migrants on a large scale does create social, political, and economic and security problems. So India never wanted an obligation here, right? We decided to deal with it on a case-to-case basis. If the situation warrants and demands, we will take refugees, or else we'll deny it. And the convention was specific to Europe initially, right? So it placed a lot of obligations on the governments. So India didn't want the burden, so we never signed the refugee convention. Later, the convention was expanded to apply to the whole world by bringing the additional protocol. Through the 1967 additional protocol, the refugee convention became applicable to the whole world, not just to European countries. It applies to any refugee situation. But despite the changes in the refugee convention, which was introduced by the additional protocol, India didn't sign it because we didn't want to take an obligation or a burden, because we wanted to deal with them on a case-to-case basis. Because India is located in a volatile region where all our neighbors are going through a crisis. So every time there is a refugee crisis, India will be forced to accept them. That becomes a major burden and obligation on India. So to avoid that, previous Indian governments had decided not to sign refugee convention and the additional protocol. So under these conventions and protocols, we have no obligation. In that regard, India was correct. But however, there is another obligation. Have you heard of Universal Declaration on Human Rights? India is a party to it. We have also signed and adopted the UN Charter as a UN member. Under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also under the UN Charter, protecting refugees is a customary obligation. It doesn't matter whether you have signed the Refugee Convention or not. Countries have an inherent obligation. They have an inherent obligation here as part of customary international law to take refugees and protect them because they are dealing with an existential crisis. Refugees, as I told you, are facing a threat to their lives. So no country can deny them. It's basic humanity to accept and protect them. Right? Even under the Constitution of India, as I explained, right to life is guaranteed to everyone, even foreigners, even refugees. Is that clear? The preamble, the very spirit of the Indian Constitution, ensures that India looks after refugees if the need arises. That's exactly what India has done in the past. So when Tibetan refugees came down, we took them in, settled them. Look at the Tibetan camps you have at Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. Right? That is where there is a parallel Tibetan government. We have allowed a parallel Tibetan government to exist, a government in exile. That's where Dalai Lama sits. Then in Karnataka, near Mysore, between Mysore and Madikeri, you have a place called Kushal Nagar. All right? It's a major Tibetan Buddhist camp, a refugee camp. This is where India has settled Tibetan Buddhists in Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh and Kushal Nagar in Karnataka. We have settled the Tamil refugees. Sri Lanka threw out Indian Tamils and we accepted them, took them in. When 10 million Bengali refugees came in from East Pakistan, India accepted them, took them in. We took in Afghan refugees later in the 90s and early 2000s. Right? So we have a history of dealing with refugees, but on a case-to-case basis. This was the first time where India was explicitly prohibiting their entry, and shockingly, the government said, we will identify and deport existing Rohingyas. Now, this triggered an even bigger controversy. See, accepting refugees is one issue. The government said in 2016, when the crisis was happening, that we will not only prohibit the entry of new refugees, but we will also identify the existing ones, the existing 40,000 refugees. And we will send them back one by one. We will deport them back to Myanmar. Now, this policy cannot be implemented by India. This, if it is implemented, it will be a violation of the principle of non-refoulement. The principle of non-refoulement is defined under Refugee Convention. Whether you have signed Refugee Convention or not, this principle is part of customary international law. According to this principle, if you send refugees back by force, if you're deporting them back to a country where they still face the risk of violence, then the country which is forcing them back will violate the principle of non-refoulement. That's what you mean by the principle of non-refoulement. That is, for example, if India picks up, detains Rohingya refugees in the country, and we forcefully send them back to Myanmar, right? If you do that, Rohingyas are being pushed back, and that is where they are facing violence. That is where the army and the radical Buddhists are targeting them because of their identity. If India were to do that, that is a violation of principle of non-refoulement. This is customary international law. Whether you have signed Refugee Convention or not, doesn't matter. Every country has this obligation that you cannot send refugees back by force to a place where they will still be targeted. You can't send them back to a country where they will still be targeted. So if you do that, it is a violation of principle of non-refoulement, which is part of customary international law. All right. So this is where India faced a lot of criticism from the UN and from human rights organizations, and even from our Supreme Court and the National Human Rights Commission. Is that clear? So this was the approach of India that triggered a major controversy. Now, why does this happen again and again? Why does this issue come up? It's because India has no refugee policy or law. Even though we have taken thousands of refugees, given them all basic facilities in India, right? We still don't have a uniform policy or a law towards refugees. In all previous cases, we have dealt with the situation on an ad hoc basis, on a case-to-case basis. When the Tibetan crisis happened, India decided to accept Tibetan refugees. When East Pakistan crisis happened, we took in Bengali refugees. So on a case-to-case situation, we took in refugees, but there is no law or policy that provides for a uniform approach, irrespective of one's country of origin, irrespective of one's religion or identity. So as a solution, you can suggest this. Let's say you get a question on this topic, right? UPSC might ask you. It might ask you to talk about the challenges created by refugee crisis and migrant issues. Not just India, European countries are also affected by it. So you have to give examples of Rohingya crisis, of the crisis in the Mediterranean, how refugees are at the receiving end, and how countries which are receiving them also are facing problems and challenges. So what is needed is a common approach, a uniform, fair approach to protect refugees, but also place some duties on them. It can't be a one-sided street, right? Government should have an obligation to protect them, give basic facilities to them, but in return, refugees have to follow the law, right? So such obligations have to be brought in through a uniform law or a policy, and we don't have that in India. Even globally, Refugee Convention is seen as outdated. The 1951 Refugee Convention is seen as outdated. It was brought out in the World War European context. That is why many countries have not signed it. So through UN, efforts are taken up for a new global compact on migration. The UN is working on a new global compact, a new global agreement. They've already brought out one compact related to illegal migration. It deals with all forms of migration, including illegal migration, refugee crisis, etc. But still it is not accepted and adopted by all the countries. The UN is still working on it. There is a global compact on migration which is being brought out. So if this is adopted, if it's a fair model for everyone, and if every country signs and adopts this model, then we will be able to better deal with such problems related to migration. So it's very important to distinguish between refugees and illegal migrants. Countries have every right to block illegal migrants, right? But refugees, you have to protect them on humanitarian grounds, right? You can't display an inhuman approach. And at the same time, it shouldn't become a burden on the country as well. That balance has to be struck. That is why you need a global framework, like the Global Compact on Migration, right? So UN has to work harder. It has to push for its adoption and ensure that refugee and illegal migrant situations are dealt with accordingly. India should also bring out its own policy or law. Maybe we can enact a law in the parliament, or at least have a well-defined policy in place. So there is a uniform approach to all refugees, irrespective of which country they're coming from, right? So that is a suggestion you can provide, and that becomes a way forward. The last point, I want you to make note of an island which is in news. It's located here in Bangladesh. It's called the Bhasan Char Island. See, Bangladesh has taken most of the Rohingya refugees. More than 1 lakh refugees have been settled in Bangladesh. There is no way they can go back. If they go back, they'll be targeted and killed again. All right. So Bangladesh has taken in lakhs of Rohingya refugees. They are settled in refugee camps. And Bangladesh has built a refugee settlement on this island called Bhasan Char Island. All right. It's in Bay of Bengal. This island is frequently in news. It's become a controversy as well, because Bhasan Char Island is a low-lying island. Remember, we had discussed this yesterday while studying Bangladesh. This region here is a low-lying area. It is very vulnerable to coastal flooding. It is vulnerable to cyclones and rising sea level. There is a very big risk of submergence of this island, and refugees could be trapped. They will have no place to go. They can't escape. So Bangladesh has essentially displaced the refugees here. It has just thrown the refugees here, built some basic facilities, and settled around 1 lakh refugees on this island. Now, this has been criticized by UN and human rights organizations because Bangladesh has put them in the path of cyclones and coastal flooding. Recently, there was a major cyclone here, right? The cyclone Umphan, that caused a lot of devastation in Bangladesh and Myanmar. This cyclone, as predicted, flooded the island and caused a humanitarian crisis, which again affected the Rohingya refugees. This is like a double wound, right? First of all, they were displaced from Myanmar, and now they are not being treated accordingly. So this controversy brings Bhasan Char Island into news. This island is constantly in news. So there might be a prelims question on this. All right. It's in news because Bangladesh has settled Rohingya refugees here. There's a big refugee settlement. The controversy is that it's a low-lying island and the refugees are at risk of natural disasters. So cyclones and coastal flooding and rising sea levels are a major threat. That is why Bangladesh has been criticized for this approach. Is that clear? So this concludes my discussion on India-Myanmar. We have covered all the important topics. Some of the key points are there in the slides. Please go back and take a look. But as part of the analysis and discussion, we have covered all that is needed for the exam. All right. I hope you guys have understood everything. Please let me know if you have any questions, any doubts. I'll take a look and then we can proceed with the next chapter. Let's see how many questions are there. Karthik has a question. Sir, yesterday we studied about Bangladesh working with Belt and Road Initiative of China, but Bangladesh does not share land borders with China. How does it work? See, Belt and Road Initiative is not just about road and rail connectivity. It also has a maritime component. So Bangladesh, yes, it does not have borders with China, but China is building maritime links with Bangladesh. It is investing in the ports of Bangladesh. It's investing in projects inside Bangladesh. Is that clear? So later, when we come to China, I'll explain what is Belt and Road Initiative. There you'll understand what the project is all about, right? It's not just about the land-based projects. It's not just about road and rail projects. It also includes maritime component as well. So China wants to connect with several countries, either through land route or through sea route. So both the projects are part of Belt and Road Initiative, and Bangladesh is a vital component for China as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. If you remember, I mentioned that China has invested in the Chittagong port of Bangladesh. It has invested in many railway projects and power projects as well in Bangladesh. So those are the investments China is making as part of Belt and Road Initiative. Famina is asking, sir, if Rohingyas are refugees, then why more than 100 Rohingyas are detained in jail and in detention centers as they are not criminals? See, this is where India faces criticism. Every now and then, local police, they detain Rohingya refugees, they put them in detention centers or jails. See, if they have committed a crime, then it is justified. But sometimes there are cases where, even though refugees have not done anything, Rohingyas have not done any crime, still they are detained, right? So this becomes controversial. From India's point of view, Rohingyas are not recognized as refugees. We haven't given them refugee status. But we can't send them back because then India would violate the principle on non-refoulement. The Rohingya refugees in India, they're trying to get refugee card from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office, which is located in New Delhi. So in these refugee camps, sometimes Rohingyas who commit certain crimes, they are taken under custody. But there are cases where innocents might also be held up, right? There is a very big political controversy as well regarding this. So that leads to the detention of Rohingyas and becomes a controversy, and India does face criticism on how the government is dealing with Rohingya refugees. Without a valid point, you can't detain refugees just because they've entered the country, right? You can't equate refugees with illegal migrants. Illegal migrants can be detained. Illegal migrants can be deported. They can be sent back to their country, right? But you can't do the same with refugees. So this is where India has to come out with a clear policy on how we are going to deal with refugees. Is that clear? Amit is asking, sir, through what mechanisms we can check pumping of fake coins and currency notes? Through better border security and better intelligence. Since fake currencies are pumped from across the border, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, etc., you have to improve your border security. You have to improve your intelligence gathering, right? So RBI will play a key role in checking the circulation of notes in the country to keep a check on fake currency notes that are circulating. But your border security agencies, intelligence agencies, they have to check the entry of fake currency notes. Vivek is asking how Soviet Union was influential in Myanmar. Soviet Union and Russia both have very good ties with Myanmar from the beginning. One, because of communist ideology. So in the Cold War period, right, Myanmar was already inclined towards communism. Even today, its model is communist model. So it was naturally close to Soviet Union and Russia. And Soviet Union and Russia have become major defense suppliers. Just like India, most of the weapons and defense equipment with Myanmar's armed forces, they are of Russian or Soviet origin. Even Myanmar has Russian fighter jets. Their naval ships, their rockets, missiles, they're all of Russian or Soviet origin. So as Russia became a major defense supplier, since the Soviet era, it has enjoyed good relations with Myanmar. Vaishna is asking, why does the democratic government in Myanmar cooperate with India, even after seeing how India maintained close ties with the military junta? See, Myanmar's democratic government that existed from 2015 to 2020, it didn't have a choice. It can't choose whether it has to maintain ties with India or not, right? Myanmar is already in a weak position. And for the first time, democracy was brought back and a government had been elected. So any government which comes to power in Myanmar will need India's help and assistance. Just because India had good ties with the military junta doesn't mean the new elected government will cut off ties with India. Right? In international relations, that's not how it works. See, for example, today, the Indian government might have very good ties with US. Now, doesn't mean if there is a change in government either here or there, doesn't mean we'll cut off the ties with them. No matter what has happened in the past, government to government relations have to be maintained, right? Irrespective of which party is in power, whether the military is in power, right? So Myanmar's government, which was there, the elected government, needed India's help and support, even though we had good ties with the military junta before, right? So the elected government didn't have the luxury of choosing whether it wants ties with India or not. It needed India, it needed India's help and support. So it had to maintain good relations with India. Prashant is asking the difference between asylum, extradition, and deportation. Asylum is seeking protection, seeking refuge. Now, let's say a Rohingya family crosses to India, comes to India, and they're asking protection in India. It means they're asking asylum. They're asking for protection. It means there is a threat to their lives back in their country. So they have come to our country asking protection for their life, for their family. They're asking for refugee status. Is that clear? So that is what you mean by seeking asylum. Extradition is where wanted criminals are sought by another country. Wanted fugitives, if they have to be brought back, they're brought back through the extradition route. Now, let's say, for example, India wants few criminals and terrorists. They're hiding in other countries. If they are arrested in the other country, and if we have an extradition treaty with them, we will urge that country to extradite them back to India. Is that clear? So that is extradition, where wanted criminals, if they are arrested in another country, if we have an extradition treaty with them, we can request their extradition. These wanted criminals are brought back so that they can face the law, so that they can be prosecuted and punished for the crimes they have committed in India. So that is extradition. Next, deportation. Deportation is where you identify illegal migrants or those who have violated the visa norms, the visa policy, right? You detain them and you send them back to their country. That is deportation. Recently, US deported Indian students. Several Indian students from Andhra Pradesh, they had got fake admissions into these fake universities. They had broken the visa norms with the help of a few middlemen. So US authorities prevented their entry into the country. They were entering illegally, according to US. So it revoked the visas which were issued and they were deported back to India. That is deportation. All right. So when illegal immigrants are found, or when a foreigner, if they have broken the visa rules and norms, then a country can detain them and send them back. That is called deportation. So this is the basic difference between asylum, extradition, and deportation. Lyron Lakpam is asking how to solve the Manipur issue. See, the Manipur issue is a very complicated issue. All right, we will discuss that in detail under internal security. It's not a IR topic, right? Let's not deviate from here. It's an ethnic problem. It's a clear social problem as well. There are deep-rooted ethnic divisions in Manipur, which had contributed to insurgency on both the sides. We have Meitei insurgents, Kuki insurgents, Naga insurgents. So Manipur has been very badly affected by insurgency and armed violence and riots from 1960s. It's not a new issue. So this issue had been tackled because we managed to tackle insurgency. We had provided for a social equilibrium. But now that has been disturbed for several reasons. All right. So this wound, which has been reopened, can be healed only through talks and negotiations. The government of India, the state government, security forces, intelligence agencies, they all have a very big role to play, right? They have to facilitate talks with different groups, work out a solution to satisfy some demands of both the sides, and ensure that the guilty, the perpetrators of this violence, they are punished. Because brutal atrocities have happened in Manipur, from rapes to murders to terror attacks. right? This can't be tolerated in a state where you have law and order, right? Law and order has broken down. So the blame lies on central government, state government, both. So they have to lead, tackle these elements, these violent elements who have triggered the crisis, deliver punishment, deliver justice, and restore normalcy by providing some justice. So it's a long process. We'll discuss that more in detail when we come to internal security. Deepshika is asking, sir, don't you think under Citizenship Amendment Act, Rohingya should have been included? See, government is not even accepting Rohingyas as refugees. Where is the question of including them under Citizenship Amendment Act for citizenship? And also understand Citizenship Amendment Act is specific to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It's specific to religious minorities who have faced persecution in these three countries, in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It does not cover Myanmar. All right. And we don't even recognize Rohingyas as refugees. The government is trying to push them back. Where is the question of thinking of giving them citizenship? Right? See, what you and I think doesn't matter. What the government thinks is that Rohingyas are not refugees. We have not recognized them or treated them as refugees. So there's no question or there's no discussion of including Rohingyas under Citizenship Amendment Act. Also, it does not apply for Myanmar. It applies only for Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. All right, let's see some questions from open section as well. Kamalpal is asking, sir, can these discussions be sufficient for PSIR optional? I had answered this in the first class itself. Whatever we study here will definitely help you in your PSIR optional, right? As far as international relations is concerned, all these topics are relevant in your optional as well. But it's not enough. Upon this, you have to bring your political science theories. Optional subject is a completely different approach. Your optional is of a honors level between your graduation and post-graduation, whereas general studies is for a common man's understanding. So you can't write the same answers. The topics are relevant, the concept, the content we are discussing, the knowledge is the same. But the way you present your answers, how you link IR with the theories of political science, that is your optional subject. So you need a different level of expertise for that. So don't assume that these classes are enough for your PSIR optional. It's not, right? You have to cover your political science theories, the thinkers, understand more about international relations in depth, and link international relations with political science theories. So that is the extra effort needed. But yes, topics are relevant. Whatever we discuss will apply, will help you in your optional. Sakshi is asking, how can military take control in a democracy? Is there a possibility of that happening in India? See, in India, the best part about our armed forces is that they have professionally stayed out of politics. Indian armed forces, there's one thing you should really credit our Indian armed forces. They have never shown political tendencies. There might be small inclinations here and there from retired officers, but while they are in service, right, our armed forces have been strictly professional, politically neutral, not getting involved in political issues of the country, because that is not their job, that is not their task. In that regard, they have firmly remained under civilian control with respect to the Indian Constitution. Our armed forces have utmost respect towards the Constitution, which provides for elected civilian government, right? So if you ask me whether there is a possibility of a military coup in India, or in the past, has it ever happened where the armed forces have considered a military coup? It has never happened. It will never happen. Is that clear? It's because of the professionalism of our Indian armed forces, their commitment to the Indian Constitution. They understand their role, their duty. Their duty is to the country to secure the national security of the nation, to defend the country against external threats, not to get involved in internal politics. Is that clear? So it's extremely unlikely that you ever witness a military coup in India. It has never happened in the past. It will never happen in the future as well. Ajit is asking when MCQ, PYQ question session will be held. We will have it next week at the start. Now that we have completed one entire week of classes, Monday, that is next week, I will start with some previous questions. We'll take a look at some prelims and mains questions for maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll start with the next chapter. All right? Aniket has a question on UN peacekeeping forces. Don't you think you're jumping ahead? We haven't discussed UN peacekeeping forces yet. We'll come to that later. The last chapter is on United Nations, right? So then I'll address this topic. Don't worry. So let's not deviate. Stick to the topics that have been covered. There's no point in asking questions that will come up later, right? We haven't even started those topics. It will come up later. Don't worry. I will explain about UN peacekeeping forces as well. All right. So guys, these were some of the questions. I tried answering as many as possible. I hope you guys have liked today's session as well. Do let me know how it went. Have a great weekend. We'll catch up again on Monday, right? So tomorrow you have your doubt clearing session for geography and economy, and we'll meet again on Monday. I'll start with some previous questions, and I will also discuss regional groupings. First, I will discuss two important regional groupings. Now that we have covered a part of our neighborhood, it's the right time to discuss SAARC and BIMSTEC. All right. So all of this might take 1 hour, 1 hour, 15 minutes. 15, 20 minutes of previous questions. Another maybe 45 minutes of SAARC and BIMSTEC. So we'll wrap it up and then we will enter the next chapter. Trust me, next week is going to be even more interesting. We'll be studying our dear neighbor Pakistan along with Afghanistan. We'll also look at China, and then we'll take a look at Indian Ocean region. So this is what we have lined up for next week, right? So don't miss the classes. Please attend and do let me know if you have any questions. Just write to us, or next week when we discuss again, please bring up any questions that you have. So I hope the sessions are good. I hope you're understanding everything. So I'll see you on Monday. Till then, take care. Have a good night. Have a great weekend.